Coming up on Bloomberg this weekend, shipping in the Strait of Hormuz at a near standstill.
They wanted to close up the Strait again, as they've been doing for years, and they can't blackmail us.
As the hours tick down to the end of the ceasefire just days away, we're in Islamabad and Washington with the latest on negotiations.
And President Trump's pick to lead the Federal Reserve heads to Capitol Hill. The questions Kevin Warsh will face as Trump's feud with Jerome Powell continues.
Plus, how to retire rich.
You may be in better shape than you realize. It's not always going to be, oh my God, you're never going to retire.
Bloomberg's personal finance reporter gives us a year-by-year breakdown on how to save for your golden years.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We are coming to you live from Bloomberg's global headquarters here in New York City. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini, along with Lisa Mateo. It is Sunday, April 19th. Welcome to our listeners and viewers across all our Bloomberg platforms, on radio, TV, streaming, on Bloomberg.com, and on the Bloomberg Business app. We've got some live photos for our TV viewers from Cape Canaveral, where Blue Origin's Glenn rocket is on the launch pad with a hold at just under 4 minutes. Its launch window for about another hour and a half. The goal is to reuse its booster for the first time.
Yeah, that booster already launched and landed back in November, and this is a key test for the heavy lift rocket to show it can compete with SpaceX, which already reuses boosters. Our Ed Ludlow spoke to the CEO of Blue Orbit. That interview is coming up later this hour. Before we get to that, though, let's get some headlines with Lisa Mateo. Lisa.
You got it. And shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, well, it remains at a near standstill. This is after Iran reversed its decision to reopen the waterway. Now, Iran now says it will remain closed until the end of the U.S. blockade on Iranian ports. Bloomberg is reporting multiple ships, including at least 9 tankers, have since reversed course. Earlier Saturday, Iran fired on at least 2 ships trying to transit the waterway. India says it's deeply concerned about 2 shooting incidents involving 2 ships flying its flag in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the U.S. reportedly putting the pressure on Iran to open the strait. The Wall Street Journal says the U.S. military preparing to board Iran-linked tankers in the coming days and seize commercial ships in international waters. Now, yesterday, President Trump told reporters there are, quote, very good conversations going on with Iran.
It's working out very well. They got a little cute, as they have been doing for 47 years, and nobody ever took them on. We took them on. They have no Navy, they have no Air Force.
Meanwhile, there are signs that the ceasefire in Lebanon could be in jeopardy. The IDF says it eliminated terrorist cell operating near its soldiers in southern Lebanon. President Emmanuel Macron also said a French soldier was killed in an attack on UN peacekeepers in Lebanon and suggested Hezbollah was to blame. In other news, North Korea launched ballistic missiles toward waters off its east coast. Authorities in South Korea, they say multiple unidentified missiles. They were fired from the Sinpo area of North Korea Sunday morning. The missiles believed to have fallen near the east coast of the Korean peninsula with no impact confirmed within Japan's territory. And Pope Leo opened the 3rd leg of his 4-nation trip through Africa. In Angola yesterday, the pontiff challenged its leaders to, quote, break the cycles of interest that have exploited Africa for centuries. Now, during his travels, Pope Leo also commented about his back and forth with President Donald Trump over the war in Iran, saying that he was not interested in debating the president, but that he would continue preaching the gospel message of peace. Christina and David.
Lisa, thank you very much.
It is still so strange to me to have an American accented pope.
Yes.
Anytime he speaks.
Speaking English.
It's very,
well.
very odd. Thanks, Lisa. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, all you.
All right. We're just days away from the end of the ceasefire between U.S. and Iran. According to Axios, President Trump held a White House sit-room meeting yesterday to talk about potential peace negotiations, as well as other issues in the Strait of Hormuz.
Right now, the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed. Joining us now from Islamabad, Pakistan, is AP international correspondent Philip Crowther, along with Bloomberg's White House correspondent Courtney Subramanian and Bloomberg Intelligence senior defense research analyst, retired Colonel Wayne Sanders. Courtney, let me start with you. We listened to the president yesterday in the Oval Office to see if he would say something about this conflict. There was a brief mention during the course of an event that was really focused on other matters entirely. But he said, we'll have some information for you by the end of the day, Saturday. We're talking to them. We're taking a tough stand. Just get us up to speed on what the administration is saying about the quality of the status of those negotiations and what we can expect here as we begin the new week.
Yeah, I mean, I would first point out that the night before aboard Air Force One, the president is the one who told us he would be talking about Iran in the Oval Office Saturday morning. So you did see a bunch of us race to the White House Saturday morning, hoping that we would get an update on the status of talks. But the president didn't take a single question, as you said. He mentioned very briefly at the top that there were very good conversations ongoing. He said that they tried to get a little cute and they tried to close up the Strait as they have done for years. As you guys know, the Strait was open before the U.S. and Israeli military campaign on Iran. We didn't hear or see the president for the rest of the day. He spent the remainder of the day at his golf club. We do know that Steve Witkoff, his golf clubs were spotted. So we do believe the president met with Steve Witkoff at his Virginia golf club.
The bag was cited.
We now know what the actual Witkoff clubs look like. Okay. That's how we're doing this?
Yes, that's where we're at.
That's
incredible. But he continues to strike an optimistic tone about the status of these talks, even as both sides, as you know, remain extremely far apart on some really core issues.
Philip, I want to go to you because we're seeing some unverified reports this morning coming through Al Jazeera that the talks are now pushed and they're saying likely sometime next week, and that's citing two unnamed Pakistani officials. Considering we still have no official details, I'm assuming this isn't happening tomorrow. Are you just in Islamabad in perpetuity now? Do you have any idea when these talks may or may not be happening?
Look, I'm here to tell you that I cannot confirm that there will be another round of talks here in Islamabad next week. But what I can tell you is that the preparations for potential talks are definitely now underway here in the Pakistani capital. You can see behind me, this is the biggest tourist attraction here in Islamabad. This is Faisal Mosque. It is still open, but the main access road to it, that is now closed. That is why you can probably not hear the sounds of motorbikes and cars and all the people we've seen over the last few days wandering toward and back and forth from Faisal Mosque. They are not here today. It is just one of many signs we are seeing here on this Saturday morning here in Islamabad that preparations are underway. The two main hotels that had been taken over by the respective delegations last weekend, they have now been taken over by the Pakistani government, meaning any guests have been told to leave. That is a very clear indication right there. And there is footage right now that is circulating all around Pakistan of U.S. military planes landing at a military base just on the outskirts of Islamabad. All of that indicates that preparations are underway. That doesn't mean that I can confirm to you that these takes will be happening. But the rumors all throughout last week were that there was going to be a second round of negotiations, despite the fact that, especially over the last 24 or 48 hours, the rhetoric has again become more aggressive between Iran and the United States, despite the fact that the Strait of Hormuz is pretty much entirely blocked right now. That does not mean that on the diplomatic front, these two sides can't be putting together the building blocks to actually see each other again in person here in Islamabad at some point next week. The date, I cannot give you right now.
Colonel Sanders, let me turn to you. And so absent comment from the president, kind of official word from the White House or from Iranian counterparts, we're looking at the latest media reporting, and there was a big piece in the Wall Street Journal that broke yesterday, and the journal's reporting that the U.S. military is preparing in the coming days to board Iran-linked oil tankers and seize commercial ships in international waters. The journal citing U.S. officials saying they're going to be expanding their naval crackdown beyond the Middle East. What does this say to you? It does seem here, as we've watched this back and forth about the Strait, whether it's open or not, that the continued presence of this U.S. blockade is really perhaps the biggest sticking point here for the Iranians and for this ceasefire generally.
Absolutely. I think it's the United States counterpoint to what Iran is doing to kind of hold the Straits hostage as they did over the weekend. I wasn't surprised to see that there was additional attack in the Strait, specifically when they were shooting at some of the tankers, just because they want to be able to add whatever leverage they possibly can. The naval blockade from the U.S. side, I think, is specifically there. Obviously, it's worked in terms of turning some of the tankers around. The use of the Marine Expeditionary Units being there, the 11th and the 13th Marine Expeditionary Units are trained in this, boarding and interdiction teams known as VBSS. I think it's one of the areas where both sides are showing, hey, look, we still have this capacity. But if you recall in the Iran-Israel conflict for the 12-day war, they continue to shoot at each other right up until the point of the agreement and even shot at each other a couple times even afterwards. So I still think that this is mostly posturing more than anything.
Philip, I want to go back to you because I want to dig into a little bit about how much we think these sides are still talking. Axios today is reporting that the Pakistani army chief, who has been kind of instrumental in facilitating this, held mediation talks by the U.S. Between the U.S. and Iran. He was in Tehran last week, and they're also reporting that there was at least one phone call between the U.S., Iran, with possibly Pakistan mediating. Do you have any information on how those efforts are going, or what communication has been happening even between the parties? As you see, it seems like they are gearing up for something there, even if we're not sure what or when.
Yeah, and certainly Pakistan, as the mediator and as the only mediator in this war right now, is confident that its efforts are working out. That's why you're seeing these preparations for a potential another round of talks here in Islamabad. And you're right to mention Asim Munir. He is the head of the armed forces. He is called by Donald Trump his favorite field marshal. He is crucial in this. He spent three days in Tehran meeting everybody on the Iranian side who is of import, who is part of this negotiating team. He met the parliament speaker. He also met the foreign minister. Those are precisely the leaders of the Iranian delegation. Now, what does a mediator do? Well, essentially passes messages back and forth. He took an American message with him to Tehran, and presumably he got one from Tehran as well to hand over to Washington. Now, I can't confirm whether there has been any direct contact between the United States and Iran during this time, during these last few days. In theory, at least, the only contact that there has been face-to-face here in Islamabad last weekend during that first round of talks. But you certainly can't deny that there's that possibility that there might be some direct contact. For now, the mediator is the one passing messages back and forth and making sure that there is some kind of common ground between the two sides. And certainly from what we're hearing here in Islamabad, the Pakistani negotiators, or mediators in this case, are pretty confident that despite, again, the rhetoric and despite all the posturing, that these are two sides that are actually getting closer.
Courtney, the president has made threats against Iran and walked the timetable back a handful of times now. And you mentioned that the president took questions on Air Force One over the weekend. On Friday, he fielded questions from reporters. Let's take a listen to what he had to say about the status of that ceasefire.
If you don't have a deal by Wednesday when the ceasefire ends, will you extend the ceasefire, or will you start attacks again?
Maybe I won't extend it.
Okay.
But the blockade is going to remain. But maybe I won't extend it. So you have a blockade, and unfortunately we'll have to start dropping bombs again.
We have to start dropping bombs again, the president saying in those comments. So, Courtney, I'd love some insight, if you have it, into how the president is thinking about the extension of this ceasefire, this pause in attacks on Iran. Again, it's coming at the end of that is coming up very shortly here, and he has been ambiguous about his willingness to extend that.
Well, that's Donald Trump's style, right? He likes to keep everyone guessing. He likes to keep everyone on edge. But I would note that we've been here several times throughout this war where the U.S. seemingly ramps up pressure just before a deadline, and then both sides pull back and extend a pause in fighting. And I think that is really the core objective here, is to just extend the pause in fighting. And one thing I'll note is the Wall Street Journal report that you referred to about the U.S. that the U.S. would begin boarding Iranian-linked ships. I asked White House officials about this yesterday, and they pointed to the Joint Chief of Staff's Chairman Dan Kane's comments at the Pentagon briefing last week, in which he had mentioned that this was going to be an option that they would pursue if things didn't progress. So I do think that there is just a bit of a pressure campaign here to really send a message to Iran that they need to come to the table and start to agree on some of these points of contention so that they can move forward for a lasting peace agreement.
Colonel Sanders, I know David asked you about that report, and I want to follow up as well. I'm wondering logistically at what point even the massive resources the U.S. has sent to the region start to get strained. If you are trying to enforce a blockade, hunt down and board these ships and examine them for, sanctions violations in other areas, other arenas, and then you're looking at the prospect of this ceasefire not holding, so potentially resuming a bombing campaign or whatever else the president wants to do. At some point, is he limited by the capacity of the U.S. military, or does that capacity expand depending on what the commander-in-chief wants it to do?
Yeah, I would say so. The capacity is strained, but it is something that can be transferable if you think about different theaters of operation. So it ends up being a decision calculus that the president has to look at and say, am I willing to take risk in other theaters like the Pacific in order to continue to bring capability over? Military Sea Lift Command has been strained in terms of creating pretty much a conveyor belt, if you will, of resources, fuel, logistics, and food, everything else that's going across. That part has played a huge part in terms of being able to prepare for the blockade. But as you mentioned, even during the ceasefire, that has still continued to be pushed, even though other areas may have stepped down, right, from aircraft overflights and number of munitions that have been spent are less. It still doesn't mean that ecosystem is strained. And so at this point in time, a lot of the operational planning, I believe, is tied into this, is saying, if this were to continue into another bombing campaign, would I be able to lift and shift fires from and resources from a different theater of operation in order to support this one?
Phil Crowther, let me go back to you and to this initial announcement that we got from the Iranian foreign minister that the Strait was open with maybe some small conditions here. What do we know about the impact that's had in Iran? I know there's been some pushback against the foreign minister by some more hardline members of that regime. What do we know about the way that that's played there and to the degree to which that represents broader government thinking about how this conflict should proceed?
Yeah, it certainly does appear that some of the statements that we have been hearing coming out of Iran have been made for either public consumption in Iran or indeed for consumption by the leadership there, by the conservative leadership of Iran. This is not a country that is necessarily entirely singing from the same hymn sheet. There are those who want to be very, very strict and impose a full-on blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, and maybe there are others who don't, and maybe who didn't agree with the initial ceasefire. So there are always different levels to this. Now, the way that this happened was, well, rather unfortunate, really, because for one moment there, we thought with the president's announcement and then also the foreign minister's announcement, as you mentioned, pretty much at exactly the same time, that the Strait of Hormuz was entirely open for traffic again. That lasted just a few hours at the end of the day, because what we're hearing now from the parliament speaker, and he's crucial in this, remember, he is the number one in this negotiating team. He again says, if there is a U.S. blockade, if we can't get through the Strait of Hormuz because the U.S. blockade is of Iranian ports, then no one else is allowed through either.
Phil Crowther, thank you very much. Phil Crowther, international correspondent for the Associated Press, along with Courtney Subramanian, our White House correspondent, and Colonel Wayne Sanders of Bloomberg Intelligence. He's our senior defense analyst.
All right, we are getting ready for an update from Florida. The countdown has resumed for Blue Origin's reusable rocket. It's set for launch now around 7:25 Eastern.
Again, there was a hold in place on that launch. Ed Ledlow will get us up to speed on that in just a few minutes.
He's lurking around here somewhere.
He's around here somewhere.
He was up bright and early. He's on it.
Also ahead, the future of the Federal Reserve. Kevin Warsh's confirmation hearing before the Senate Banking Committee is scheduled for this week, while the White House ups the pressure on outgoing Fed Chair Jerome Powell. Michael McKee, Tyler Kendall are going to join us straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend, on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, at Bloomberg.com, and on the Bloomberg Business app.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's stories. And authorities in Ukraine, they are investigating the motive behind a mass shooting in Kyiv on Saturday. They say a gunman killed 6 people and injured 14 others before police shot and killed him. Police say the 58-year-old suspect, who was born in Russia, he barricaded himself inside a supermarket with hostages after opening fire on a busy street. Havana's nightlife falls dark as its energy crisis under the U.S. oil embargo deepens. Cuba has been in an economic freefall ever since the United States cut off its oil shipments from the island from Venezuela and Mexico in January. Now, meanwhile, President Donald Trump ramping up pressure on Havana. The New York Times is reporting the Trump administration sent a senior delegation to Cuba last week to address the humanitarian crisis on the island. The U.S. officials reportedly told Cuba's leadership that it had narrow window of time to make certain economic and political changes were made. And more aggravation may be in store for airline travelers in the coming months. Higher jet fuel prices, they have carriers worldwide increasing cancellations, grounding planes. Now, prediction data from Cirium, it shows that global capacity for May has been reduced, with all but one of the 20 largest airlines cutting flights. Christina and David, not what you want to hear after all the other airport.
I bought my tickets early. Benedict Campbell was on the show, said buy your tickets now, and I have this fear that as this progresses, that'll all be for naught if they cancel these flights.
That wouldn't bring me any joy at all after you've
that.
lambasted me
I
for
know
not
that.
buying my tickets at all if you had ticketing
Touche.
problems. That would be schadenfreude. That would make me a bad person. Thanks, Lisa.
You got it.
All right, speaking of things we hope take off without incident, we are watching this Blue Origin's launch this morning. Live pictures moments away from the rocket in Cape Canaveral, Florida, taking off. You can see it there on the left side of the screens for our viewers. For our audio listeners, it is a rocket on a platform waiting to take off.
Yes, launch pad 36. Am I right? Ed Ludlow is here with us to guide us through all of this. You've been watching. We're doing it now.
You tell us.
You and I and we. You've been watching all this. There was this hold about 3.5 minutes in. What was happening here? It looked like things were proceeding at pace, and then there was a stop.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say for the radio audience listening, that what we showed is a 98 meters tall, 321
It's quite sizable. This is a big vehicle.
Of Blue Origin. Blue Origin is the space company founded by Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon and one of the world's richest people. And it's a powerful launch system. And, you know, we're about 90 seconds away from launch. You tell me if we're going to take this launch or not, but right now, things are counting down.
We're going to take it.
It's so normal for them to take pause. These are highly autonomous systems, and there are all kinds of imponderables: the weather, human error, data glitches, engineering glitches. So what they often do is just say, okay, everyone stop, reset, and let all the different teams that are tracking the launch system catch up with one another. That's kind of what happened today, and there'll be a post-mortem on that, but we're 60 seconds away from launch. And the significance of this, guys, is that New Glenn is the flagship, more powerful system. It's the first time they'll refly a booster that's flown before. That was in November, New Glenn 2.
Which we've seen from SpaceX, but they haven't done this before?
They have not done this before with New Glenn.
Got it,
They have two separate systems. We can talk later on about the sort of weaker system that focused on space tourism. But this is kind of what Blue hopes will take on SpaceX's Falcon 9 Heavy and Starship.
And within this, above the rocket, rather, there's a satellite. For cellular service. What do we have on board?
Yeah. So AST Space Mobile is the customer in this case, and they think about it as a ginormous cell tower in space. That's what that payload, that satellite will do. I don't know. Shall we listen in?
You guide us through this. Let's listen in.
About 10 seconds left. Yeah.
When turned on, it will provide acoustic suppression to protect the vehicle from shock waves and also to cool the launch pad. There we go.
3, 2,
Big water.
1.
We're at T-minus 3 seconds.
Gyno, provide first motion time. First motion time, 11:25:01.
And New Glenn has cleared the tower. As you follow New Glenn's journey along, look to the bottom of your screen. You can see telemetry there, as well as our time clock.
Vehicle's now completing the pitch over maneuver. Straits now level. 45.
Auto-sweeping complete.
And walk us through what's happening here. 2 stages in this launch?
2 stages. So at the bottom of the launch system are 7 BE-4 engines, and those generate about 550,000 pounds of force per engine. And so when you get to the kind of 60-second mark into the mission, you're approaching what's known as max Q. It's the moment of maximum aerodynamic pressure or stress, because like this beautiful view of Florida. For those watching, I love this because like in modern day, space launch, there's all of these cameras giving real-time signal.
I was just going to say, and when it took off, there was a really cool shot of like the bottom of the boosters.
Yeah,
you could see all the colors. It was never seen anything like that.
I don't know which brand they use, but like for the radio audience, just imagine a GoPro strapped to the bottom of the rocket, just facing downward and showing a beautiful sort of increasingly curving view of the Earth focused on Florida. And so the second stage, so that's good old-fashioned rocket science, and those use rocket fuel. The second stage actually uses a mixture of hydrogen and oxygen in what's called a BE-7 engine. And the reason that you do that is like you're trying to get to an orbital height with high energy, and hydrogen and oxygen is a really good way of doing that. So I don't know if we're going to go through the full sequencing of it, but those 2 stages separate. In the booster, the main primary stage falls back down to Earth. You're seeing the bottom of it now. And the whole point of this, the economics of what we're talking about, is for it to land itself back on a platform in the ocean so that it can be reused.
How many times are we talking about here?
Well, so this is, again, the significance of New Glenn 3. The New Glenn program let's say it's over budget and behind schedule a little bit against its original stated goals, which is very common in the space industry. But this will be wow, what a beautiful way of looking at it. This would be only the first time they've reused a booster that's flown before, and that booster only flew in November. But, in speaking with the company, which we may get to, I think that they're now in a place where they're going to really ramp up the cadence of launching this system.
Let's do that. So you had this interview, and you were telling me it's not just about this launch. It's more about their long-term plan and their ultimate goal.
Because this New Glenn system, this is the system that Blue wants to get their company and their company's participation in getting America back to the moon.
All right, let's listen. It's Ed Ludlow in conversation with CEO Dave Limp.
I think it'd be a really good year if we could do, 8 to 12 flights this year, up from 2 last year. That would be, that'd be a good cadence for us. I can see a path that we have plenty of hardware to do that. It really is what we learn from the flights. I would tell you that there's never been a time where launch is in such demand. And by the way, I think the demand's going up with all these direct-to-device announcements. Amazon made one, obviously. Other AST is doing direct-to-device, and these mega constellations. We have our own constellation we announced with TerraWave. That if I could fly a rocket every week right now, I would be sold out for the indefinite future. And so our job is to get out there, get as fast a cadence as we can, as quickly as possible. And the foundation of that, again, is just to build a world-class manufacturing business. And that's something I've done for a long time, and the team's done for a long time. And I think we're on the right path. We still have a ways to go, but I'm excited about the progress.
The world became familiar with Blue Origin through New Shepard, the smaller form factor launch system, and the first focus of that was kind of space tourism. Going to a pretty low altitude, relatively speaking, for a few minutes of weightlessness. And, of course, I was in Van Horn, Texas, when Jeff Bezos himself went up. But you took the decision to halt that program, in large part to focus on Blue's participation in getting America back to the moon. And so, in the first instance, Dave, what has the result of that decision been? Have you been able to accelerate that other program, the Lunar program? How have you moved and reassigned resource and people to fulfill that ambition?
Yeah, we were able to fly 98 people above the Kármán line. I've never seen so many smiles on every astronaut that we were able to do that for. And I think if you had to make the decision to put New Shepard on pause, we put on pause for at least 2 years. With your heart, it would have been a very hard decision, because you saw it when you saw Jeff fly. Every customer is the happiest customer you've ever seen. But when you make that decision with your head, it was probably one of the simpler business decisions that I and Jeff have ever made, because I'm so passionate about getting the U.S. back to the moon. As is Jeff. It's I don't think the country wants another Sputnik moment. We have been saying at Blue for 20 plus years that the moon is this incredible gift given to us. It's 3 days away. It's got all the resources that we'll ever need right there, at least for the foreseeable millennium ahead of us, and we know how to get there.
The moon is back.
It's the focus of this country, right? And NASA as the agency leads it, but in commercial space, SpaceX is now deepening its involvement in the plan, and Blue Origin also is in with a really good shot of being a really big participant in the Artemis program. But separate from that, again bringing it back to the launch that we're covering here today, New Glenn 3, this is the launch system, the rocket that will get their I guess more cargo type lunar lander to the moon's surface. And what I think that Dave went on to say at that interview is that there's a really good shot that if New Glenn goes well, and we'll track it, hopefully the booster lands, but that program will put a cargo focused lunar lander on the moon by the end of this year, later this year.
Wow, that's soon.
Yeah. And so this is kind of consistent with NASA and with Jared Isaacman, the administrator. This is a simple plan. Flood the moon's surface with stuff. Literally like cargo-focused landers, materials to build a base on the moon. And like if we had launched Bloomberg this weekend, even 3 or 4 years ago, and I had said that, you guys would have laughed me offset. But now there's a lot of buy-in across the industry and politically as well to do this.
This is the thing Ed says, because we talked about data centers in space and I laughed.
You did.
When you brought that up.
Yes.
Now look where we are. He spoke about demand. Let's wrap up by talking about that.
Yeah.
How much demand this company and others see for continuing to launch satellites like this into space.
Yeah, so like, again, the mission on the screen, AST is a customer and they paid money for this. So it's important that they can actually ramp up cadence so they can book revenues. Space is an expensive business and you measure the economics of that on a dollar per kilo basis. Blue Origin's dollar per kilo now is in the thousands of dollars, and they would hope with time to take zeros off that, right? That's kind of what they're building towards. They need customers to do that. It's so interesting, like we don't have time for the full history lesson, but people forget in 2015, Blue Origin landed a booster back on Earth before SpaceX did. It's just that SpaceX then massively pulled away. And so, they have all kinds of cellular or internet, constellation-based internet opportunity with Amazon, which is trying to take on Starlink with AST, things like that.
Wow, that's amazing. All right, Ed, we're going to have to leave it there for now.
There is that booster coming back down.
But you are coming back at the end of the show.
I hope so.
To play the news quiz. We're going to make it happen. All right, just a little while ago, ABC's Jonathan Karl posted on social media saying he spoke to President Trump about a potential deal, with Trump saying, quote, "It will happen one way or another." This, of course, is a deal with Iran. The nice way or the hard way, it's going to happen. You can quote me.
And Jonathan Karl did right there on the social media platform X. We'll have more on that and on Trump's pick for chair of the Federal Reserve, heading to Capitol Hill for a hearing before the Senate Banking Committee. That is coming up on Bloomberg this morning, right here on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg.com. Kevin Warsh proceeding with that hearing before the Senate Banking Committee as the president continues his attacks on the Fed chair, and as Thom Tillis, the senator from North Carolina, continues to block the nomination of any Fed official going forward until the investigations into him, Jay Powell, are lifted. Much more to come here on Bloomberg TV and Bloomberg Radio.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. And cleanup is underway across the Midwest after a string of tornadoes and severe storms ripped through communities from the Great Lakes to Texas. The National Weather Service says 26 tornado warnings they were issued for Wisconsin alone. No deaths have been reported from the storms, but thousands of homes and businesses have been damaged or destroyed. Officials are bracing for residents for a long recovery in some rural communities. And in tech news, victory for a humanoid robot in Beijing after it beat the human half marathon world record. This video, if you're watching, it's amazing. The winner of the race for robots was from a Chinese smartphone maker. It completed the 13-mile race in 50 minutes and 26 seconds. And that's a big difference from the 2-hour and 40-minute finish last year from the winner last time. And Blue Origin right now, you're taking a look at some live pictures, okay? It's going to be the booster. Oh, this is actually when it took off. Okay, so it was getting ready to take off. This is Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket. It blasted off from the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida this morning. There it goes. Now what happened is that booster from Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket, it fell back down, landed on a vessel in the ocean, and that is where it is sitting now. Christina and David.
Thanks, Lisa. The Senate Banking Committee is going to get its first chance to publicly question Kevin Warsh this week as they consider his nomination to lead the Federal Reserve.
Current Chair Jerome Powell has less than 1 month left in his term, but it's not clear what will actually happen when that term expires. Here to walk us through what's at stake, Michael McKee, our Chief International Economics and Policy Correspondent, and Tyler Kendall, our Washington Correspondent, are with us. Mike, let me start with you. You're going to be there for the hearing this week, and I'm curious, how is this going to unfold? There's been so much protestation from the Senator from North Carolina, Thom Tillis. What's it going to be like in the hearing room when this takes place?
It'll be probably a little more interesting than usual because there's some questions certainly about Kevin Warsh's views and how he would run the Fed. But it's not going to be any kind of hearing that would end in him not getting the job. Republicans are pretty much aligned. The Thom Tillis situation isn't going to change until the administration drops its probe into Jay Powell. But they can hold a hearing and then hold off on a vote until such time as the senator decides he can vote one way or another. And then Warsh is expected to be confirmed. They've got to get him to the floor. It's always hard to get floor time in the Senate. So it is certainly possible that it ends up with Jay Powell staying on for a bit as chair.
Tyler, can you update us? What is the latest with that investigation? Because we had this moment last week where you had these prosecutors from the D.C. Attorney General's office show up at the Federal Reserve and were turned away. And then we have this tweet then from Senator Tillis where he tweeted a photo of the Three Stooges in response. Do you think he's going to hold his ground on this? Do you think the investigation is going to keep going? Or are we just going to stay at loggerheads?
Well, Christina, at this point, Tom Tillis is indicating that he is going to hold firm on not voting to advance the nomination to the full floor. Now, the Trump administration was handed a potential off-ramp last month when the judge had blocked the subpoenas by the Department of Justice. But at this point, as you're indicating, these reports that we saw, some of these prosecutors show up at the Federal Reserve and statements from officials themselves saying that they are vowing to appeal that decision. So as of now, the Trump administration is maintaining its course. The thing is, Tom Tillis really does have the power to derail this. At this point, Republicans only have a 13-11 majority on the committee, so he is that key swing vote. Now, I can say I've heard it suggested before that maybe Republicans could try to find a workaround to this by doing what's known as a discharge petition. I have to say, though, I called up a few sources on the Hill when this idea seemed to be circulating, and it would be a lot easier said than done for a flurry of reasons, including that when this happens, it would be subject to debate, which means that we would have to see what's known as cloture invoked. And that would require 2/3 of the Senate to get on board, which means that Republicans would need Democrats to get on board. And at this point, they're not. Christina and David, we're actually seeing pushback from Democrats that they want to delay Tuesday's planned testimony. A letter was just sent to the Senate Banking Chair, Tim Scott, saying that they stand with Tom Tillis, that as long as this legal matter against Fed Chair Jerome Powell is not resolved, they don't want to have a hearing at all.
Tyler, we heard from the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee, Elizabeth Warren, who expressed some hesitation about the financial disclosure that Kevin Warsh filed with that committee ahead of the hearing. What is she upset about or interested in learning more about?
So she's saying that the full assets of Kevin Warsh weren't properly disclosed in these financial hearings. Michael McKee may have a little bit more information on this because we just got his disclosure showing that he has an upwards personal net worth value of $190 million. So we'll see where this goes, but it sort of tracks with what we had been expecting from the ranking member, Senator Elizabeth Warren, who has long been an opponent of Kevin Warsh's nomination and being that person on the banking committee that has tried to be a pushback to the Trump administration's policies when it comes to this.
Mike, I want to ask you, because there is a deadline here. Powell's term expires on May 15th, but he could stay on as governor, as we've been talking about. But President Trump last week ratcheted up the pressure yet again. We've got some sound for you.
Whether it's incompetence, corruption, or both, I think you have to find out. I really do. I think you have to find out.
So you're not going to drop the probe?
Oh, I'm not playing. I have to find out.
And he said he's not leaving if,
Well, then I'll have to fire him, okay? If he's not leaving on time, I've held back firing him. I've wanted to fire him, but I hate to be controversial.
All right, so what happens if Trump does fire him? How would the markets react? And do you think this is still a possibility?
Well, ordinarily, you'd say that the markets would react very badly to this. And when the issue first came up last year, or even in the first term, they did go down. But I'm not sure the markets would believe Trump will succeed in firing Jay Powell, because so much has happened in the meantime. The Fed has already said that if Kevin Warsh is not confirmed in time, Powell will continue on. The person who is chair of the Board of Governors, there's a legal question about whether it can be Powell or whether the president gets a choice. But the person in charge of monetary policy would remain Jay Powell, because he was chosen by the Open Market Committee for a year's term. So nothing really would happen there. And I don't think the markets would have to panic over that. The idea would be that eventually the president would have to take it to court. But by the time it could get through the court system, Warsh would probably be confirmed. And at that point, it would be a moot issue. So the whole thing is perhaps a little more of an issue, a blown up issue that isn't going to happen than it may seem.
Mike, what do we know of Chair Powell's plans at this point? So a few meetings back, he said he'd announce what he planned to do at the appropriate time. At the last meeting, he said he'd stick around until a successor is named. Not asking you to psychoanalyze what Jay Powell is thinking, but do we have a better sense of how he's regarding the position, the governor position, going forward?
Well, we know he has told people, he has suggested that he does want to leave the Fed when his term as chair is up. And it's been tradition that Fed chairs, when their term as chair up, they resign their position even if they have time left on their governor's seat. But the governor's seat is the only real leverage that Powell has against Trump if they want to pursue this whole issue of the building overruns and the investigation that Jeanine Pirro is running. So he has said, until and unless that is completely gone, he's going to remain on the open market committee, remain on the board as a governor. So that part has yet to play out. And it'll be interesting to see what the administration decides, because the way they're handling this is very odd. The president wants a new chair. He wants a chair that wants lower interest rates. And yet all of the administration's actions are keeping him from getting that. So at some point you wonder, when are they going to give up and take the win?
Mike, I am going to ask you to psychoanalyze Jay Powell. No, I'm kidding. I really won't do that. But I do want to ask you what this means for the reputation of the Fed overall, for what it means for people's reliance on its consistency, and if that's been damaged by this whole process going forward.
Well, if, for example, the Supreme Court should rule in a way that would allow the president to actually fire Jay Powell, and he did that, that would put a big stain on the credibility of the Fed. The Fed's already had some problems with its inability to bring inflation under control quickly over the last 3-4 years. There are questions about certainly the way they handled the great financial crisis. So a new chair coming in would want to try to rebuild credibility and would not need an additional boulder on their back to push up the hill. Kevin Warsh, there are questions about whether he's going to be the president's man and push for lower rates, even if lower rates aren't called for, or whether he's going to really defend the Fed's independence. So that'll be an interesting line of questioning at the hearing.
Absolutely. Michael McKee, Tyler Kendall, thank you both very much. Up next, from bizarre foods to seafood, Chef Andrew Zimmern sharing his recipes for sustainability ahead of Earth Day. Up ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend. Earth Day is this Wednesday, April 22nd, and of course, one of the biggest threats to the planet is climate change. According to a recent study, climate change could cost the world economy some $38 trillion per year by the middle of the century.
And of course, climate change also impacts the food we eat, how we eat it, how we get it. And joining us now is award-winning chef, TV host, and restaurateur Andrew Zimmern. He's also the author of a new cookbook, the Blue Food Cookbook, Delicious Seafood Recipes for a Sustainable Future. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So explain to us, blue foods, is that like blue zones? We talk about those for health? Or what does this mean, and why did you want to write this?
No, that's my buddy Dan Buettner's book, which is great. In an odd turn of consequences, the production company that I own produces his podcast, and he's one of my best friends. A great book, and you should buy that too.
So you're like, blue works for him. I'm gonna use it as well. I got it.
That's exactly. Well, exactly. The United Nations used this term over a decade ago, and then nobody else did. And my co-author Barton Seaver and our collaborators at Fed by Blue, who helped vet all the technical information in the book, we all felt it was really important to come up with a way to talk about food that comes from water, fish, shellfish, lake fish, brook trout, seaweeds, very importantly, and be able to talk about them from a global perspective, as opposed to green foods and green economies, which are obviously terrestrial. If we want to combat climate change, if we want to feed a hungrier planet, if we want to do so economically, and we want to make sure that hunger is something that is statistically eliminated on planet Earth, which is actually possible to do, there is a path to success for that, then all the solutions start with blue foods and our water systems. Most importantly, because we have to protect them, but we also have to produce from them at the same time. Every second breath we take comes from the ocean. And by working on the ocean and working in the ocean and all of our water systems, we can do a better job of protecting it and producing from it at the same time.
We're going to ask about at least one recipe here in a moment, but let me just ask you about, when I go to the store and buy seafood, what should I be looking for? In other words, in the spirit of going after blue foods, what are the best things for me to target or purchase as a food-eating consumer here in America in 2026?
You should simply ask the person who's behind the counter or wearing the red vest if they're stocking the frozen aisle or the canned aisle. Because remember, responsibly sourced seafoods that are properly handled are in 3 places in your markets. But ask the person, about the catch of the day. Ask about what's fresh. Ask, most importantly, is it responsibly sourced? The questions that people ask themselves with fish and shellfish all the time is fresh or frozen, wild or farmed, and those questions are really irrelevant. There are bad actors in the fresh and frozen space. There are bad actors in the farmed and the wild fisheries management space, but the good actors far outweigh them.
Well, there's a recipe in here for chocolate chip kelp brownies. Seafood can be a dessert. Any other outliers that you think might take some convincing, but you're going to stand by?
Well, the seaweed in dessert is just a great way to get something super healthy into your body. The FAO and the OMB all estimate that by 2045, which is 19 years from now, we will producing more seafood by weight in America than we will potatoes. Think about that. Seaweed is the food of the future. It requires very little equipment, and it is all a plus side. I would encourage people to be eating nutritious, oily fish that are good for our brain health and our body's development. A sardine, a fresh sardine, but also a tinned one, are literally perfect foods when it comes to our health. We need to be incorporating more foods like that into our diets.
I want to ask you lastly just about the changes that we've seen in terms of availability of fish, lobster, bivalves as well. Climate change is having a role there. How do you think about that in the context of what you're advocating people eat or go after? How much is that landscape changing?
Well, it changes all the time, which is why I've been calling for, in America, for, one national agency to help us monitor seafood. Right now, we have an alphabet soup of different agencies, all of which are doing good jobs, but nobody is really talking to each other. It's also why I've advocated for a Secretary of Food, a cabinet-level position. Food and food-adjacent businesses are one of the largest sections of GDP. Independent restaurants alone, forget about farms and all of the food production companies, but just independent restaurants alone is about 6% of GDP. We have food decisions being made by 6 different alphabet agencies in Washington, D.C. alone. So I think we need to centralize all that under one office. I think the other thing that we need to do is we need to remember that the oceans are always changing. What's available one day is not available the other. Lobsters are marching north to colder climates. So are crabs in search of food. And I think what people should do is they should be communicating more with the person behind the counter at a supermarket, at a big box store, or at a fish store about what that store thinks they should be eating. Let them right now be the gatekeepers for you. Eat lower on the food chain and try to make sure that you become a good global citizen. To answer David's question more exactly, shop the fish, not the dish. If you go into the market and you're going to make fish and chips with cod and cod's not there, ask the person behind the counter, hey, I was going to make fish and chips with cod. There's no cod. What should I use instead? Let those people help be your guidepost. Shop the dish, not the fish.
All right. I think we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
All right. The book is The Blue Food Cookbook, Delicious Seafood Recipes for a Sustainable Future.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is 8 a.m. in New York. We are coming to you live from Bloomberg's global headquarters. I'm
David
Christina.
Gura. Sorry, I jumped on you there.
That's okay.
I'm Christina Ruffini. That's David Gura.
Yes, thank you very much. Bringing you the latest breaking news, reports, and analysis live this morning and every weekend from 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock Wall Street time. And some breaking news just happening a few minutes ago. President Trump spoke to ABC's Jonathan Karl about the potential of a peace deal in Iran.
Karl says Trump told him Iran has committed serious violations of the ceasefire, but President Trump thinks a peace deal is still possible. Quote, it will happen one way or another. The nice way or the hard way, it's going to happen. You can quote me.
You can quote me. Let's get to Lisa Mateo with the latest on what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz. Lisa.
You got it. It is, yes, it still remains largely closed. This is as Iran goes against what the president just said and says it's far from a final deal with the U.S. Now, it comes after Iran. It reversed course on reopening the waterway, saying that it would stay closed until the end of the U.S. blockade on Iranian ports. Now, Bloomberg reporting multiple ships, including at least 9 tankers, have since reversed course. Earlier Saturday, Iran fired on at least 2 ships trying to transit the waterway. The U.S. is reportedly putting the pressure on Iran to open the strait. Now, the Wall Street Journal says the U.S. military preparing to board Iran-linked oil tankers in the coming days and seize commercial ships in international waters. Yesterday, President Trump told reporters in the Oval Office that there are, quote, very good conversations going on with Iran.
We're talking to them. They wanted to close up the strait again, you know, as they've been doing for years, and they can't blackmail us.
Now, meanwhile, there are signs a ceasefire in Lebanon could be in jeopardy. The IDF, it says it eliminated a terrorist cell operating near its soldiers in southern Lebanon. President Emmanuel Macron also said a French soldier was killed in an attack on a UN peacekeepers in Lebanon and suggested Hezbollah was to blame. And the booster from Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket, well, it has returned. It landed on a vessel in the ocean. Now, the rocket, it blasted off from the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida this morning. It reused that booster for the first time to launch the massive 300-foot-tall rocket. It's one of the largest in the world. It also carried a communications satellite for the company AST Space Mobile. And we brought that to everybody live this morning
with
cool
Ed Ludlow. Great to have Ed here to
yeah.
walk us through it. And I'm really struck by what he said, that, you know, everybody is now focused on the moon.
That's
the country,
incredible
all of these
to me.
companies
And then we're
as
just
well.
going to preset a bunch of stuff up there so that we can get up there and build a moon base.
Clutter it with
It's incredible. My 4th grade self could never. That's very, very cool.
The ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran expiring in days in the Strait of Hormuz, as Lisa just mentioned, remains a key issue for the White House as it remains effectively closed by Iran. The president held a meeting just yesterday to discuss the strait as well as potential peace negotiations, having said this just hours before on Air Force One.
Sir, in the Strait, are there going to be restrictions and tolls managed by Iran for ships and vessels passing through?
No way. No.
None at all?
Nope.
No restrictions?
Mr. President, you talked to Kajsa, Mr. President.
Restrictions, yeah, there'll be restrictions. You can't do the tolls. No, they're not going to be tolls.
Back with us from Islamabad, Pakistan, is AP international correspondent Philip Crowther. Philip, we're now approaching the end of this ceasefire in a couple days, and we still don't have information about the next round of talks. Which of these things do we think is going to happen, and how are people feeling about where this ceasefire is and whether or not it's going to hold long enough for these talks to occur?
Well, I think the main priority really for the United States and Iran is to be able to somehow extend this ceasefire, because it ends on Wednesday and there are no guarantees from here that we're going to see the two negotiating teams see each other again face to face here in Islamabad before that day. Though the feeling here in the Pakistani capital, and also the impressions we're getting with our own eyes, is that certainly the preparations here are underway. Again, just for a potential second round of talks, but still. You can see behind me, this is Faisal Mosque. It is the main tourist attraction here in Islamabad. The access road, very, very quiet indeed. Bar for that motorcycle just driving by. Otherwise, very quiet indeed. The main access road closed here. And that's not the only indication we have here. The 2 hotels that the 2 negotiating teams took over last weekend, they have now been taken over by the Pakistani government, presumably so that those delegations can again stay there if another round of talks is to happen. Also, images, video of U.S. military planes landing at an Air Force base not far from here, the Pakistani capital. Those are circulating around Pakistan right now. People are excited that this could be the place for a second round of negotiations, and maybe even more for an actual deal of some sort to be signed. There are a lot of stumbling blocks still, and as you've already mentioned, the rhetoric doesn't sound great from the Iranian and the US side, and indeed the Strait of Hormuz remains pretty much entirely blocked, but that does not mean that behind the scenes these two sides can't get closer and closer together, close enough to at the very least meet face-to-face here in Islamabad again at some point next week.
Phil, before you were in Islamabad, you were there on the Strait. I know you've been tracking what's been happening there closely. So there's the rhetorical confusion that we've been talking about, what the President of the United States has been saying versus what Iranian officials have been saying. We note that ships are awaiting instructions from Iran's armed forces, according to the Mer news agency in Iran. What, in fact, is happening there in that waterway at this moment? Many ships there are still at a standstill, but where are they looking to for information? What information, indeed, are they getting?
Well, essentially, the situation that we're in right now is more or less exactly the same as before this ceasefire first came into place. Dueling blockades is what you're looking at. And the Iranian parliamentary speaker, he is, by the way, the leader of the Iranian delegation for talks with the United States. He says essentially this: if you, as in the United States, block our ports, then we're not going to allow anybody else through the Strait of Hormuz either. So you've got two blockades at the same time and no traffic whatsoever. There was a very short window of opportunity yesterday. That's when a few ships managed to make their way through. But as soon as Iran said, no, the Strait of Hormuz is now again blocked by us, that is when there were attacks from, at least in one case, 2 Iranian gunships on a tanker that was attempting to get through the Strait of Hormuz, and there have been other incidents as well. And that is pretty much exactly what we saw before the ceasefire was signed between the United States and Israel on one side and Iran on the other. I think the two things can happen at the same time: a reopening of negotiations between the US and Iran, and also a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. What comes first, we'll have to wait and see.
Philip, I know that you are talking to us and not watching Fox News. So at the moment, it appears the president is talking to Fox. We've got a couple headlines crossing the terminal. The first biggest one is Trump says Iran deal to, quote, blow up. Trump says Iran to, quote, blow up if deal not signed. He also says Steve Witkoff is heading to Pakistan and it may last into Wednesday. Yes, it says Trump says Witkoff is heading to Pakistan for Tuesday meetings. So you might have company there after all in the near future. I'm sure you're not seeing any planes landing yet.
I'll ask you, Phil, if I could
just...
That's
your first indication
there you go.
Of who might be part of the delegations. And I think that's crucial. I mean, that's the first time we hear a name mentioned, actually. That's what we were expecting here, that Steve Witkoff might be the one at the head of the U.S. delegation. There's been all sorts of rumors whether J.D. Vance, the vice president, might be here as well. That's the first name that's named. And if it's named by the president, well, then we can presume he's going to be the one who will be leading that delegation. That is a further confirmation, if you will. And I think it's actually the first real confirmation that we're getting that talks will be happening again here in Islamabad, coming from the U.S. side.
Phil Crowther laying out all the circumstantial evidence that those talks would continue over the course of the morning, now having that confirmation, as you mentioned, Christina. Phil, thank you very much for joining us. Phil Crowther, international correspondent for the Associated Press, joining us there from Pakistan. And Christina, that is a very interesting wrinkle here. The fact that you had J.D. Vance, the vice president, there for the first round of these talks, unsuccessful talks, I should say. Now the president seemingly shuffling who he is going to be sending on that diplomatic mission. Right,
and with the stakes ratcheting higher, you're sending a lower level individual to go try to make this happen. I wonder what the strategy of that is, and you know who might be a good person to talk about that? Totally. That is our next guest, John Feiner. He's the former principal deputy national security advisor under President Biden. John, it's nice to see you. I'm not sure if you could hear, we're seeing President Trump is doing an interview with Fox News right now, and we have the first real, as Philip was just saying, tangible notes about what's going to be happening. It looks like Steve Witkoff is on his way to Pakistan for hopefully meetings on Tuesday with the Iranians. What's your take on who's being sent to these meetings and whether or not they're going to be productive?
Well, I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing if the United States and Iran are actually talking, as opposed to simply tweeting at each other, nasty things that suggest a breakdown. But we've seen this movie before, heading into a week in which I think the president is probably concerned about market reaction. He wants to send a positive signal that maybe at a minimum these talks could be extended and the ceasefire could continue. But the fundamental problem, and there are two of them, have not been addressed. One is that the Strait of Hormuz remains closed. And there's no indication that unless the United States puts something serious on the table to compensate Iran in some way, sanctions relief or something else, that the Iranians are inclined to open it. And second, this nuclear material, which we've talked about for weeks now, highly enriched uranium that Iran retains, despite the United States having bombed it many times and told Iran they have to give this up in order for the war to end. Those are the two big issues in the talks, and we don't seem any closer to resolving them.
John, I want to ask you about realism in the context of these negotiations. And you have a deep familiarity, of course, with negotiations involving the Iranians. And we've talked over the last few weekends just about the amount of time it took to get to the JCPOA agreement. This was something we measured in months, not in weeks or days, as it seems like we're trying to do here. So I'm curious what you observed about that first round of talks when the vice president went to Pakistan, emerged from those meetings with nothing to show for them. Now we have Steve Witkoff going there. What does it say to you about how we should be thinking realistically about the way that these two sides can come to some sort of agreement here to stop the fighting in the Middle East?
Well, as you said, I was part of negotiations with Iran that took place over a period of several years. Even the final phase of the negotiations to reach the Iran nuclear deal back in 2015 took 19 consecutive days for the Secretary of State deployed to Vienna to really just finish off the last few issues in the talks. It was the longest any Secretary of State, John Kerry in that case, had ever been outside the country in one place in the history of the United States. Negotiations with the Iranians take time, they take patience, they take expertise, and airdropping the vice president into Pakistan for one day was never going to get the job done. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if J.D. Vance does not go to this round. The vice president has many wide-ranging responsibilities, probably can't just live in Pakistan for long enough to get a deal like this done. But whoever goes is going to have to treat this as a serious, detailed, technical exercise. The Iranians know what they're looking for. They know the file, and they are going to be willing to put in the time. We have to be willing to take that same approach.
Talk to us about the technical aspect of that, because one of the criticisms I've heard from people inside the State Department and at the IAEA is that Steve Witkoff may be very good at negotiating in his private sector life, but he's not a technical expert. He does not know the ins and outs of nuclear material, how to move it, enrichment levels, things like that. And they're not bringing those experts with them, even for these brief stints of negotiations. Do you think, have you heard concern that they don't have the knowledge base to successfully carry out these negotiations? Is there a chance they're going to get hoodwinked by the Iranians?
Well, look, not every negotiator can be an expert on all of the different elements involved in these talks. There are technical issues regarding nuclear physics and the inputs to a potential nuclear weapon. There are technical sanctions issues, legal technicalities about how you would give Iran maybe sanctions relief in some cases and not in others. Very careful wording. You don't need to be an expert in all those things, but as you just said, what you do need is expertise in the team while you're negotiating so that you can check Iranian demands against somebody who really does know the ins and outs and what the implications of a concession or a demand might be. And one of the problems in this administration is they don't seem to have a lot of respect for expertise. Many experts in the U.S. government have been driven out of their jobs during the course of the first 1 year plus of the Trump administration. So whether there are even enough people left in these buildings to be able to help the talks is one question. Whether, if they are there, they're going to be brought to Pakistan, I think is another. And if you just look at the history of how these talks have gone up till now, they don't seem to be relying too heavily on experts. They go by vibes, they go by feel, and that has not worked out so well so far.
John, indulge me for a moment here. You've done enough cable news to know that the president tweets or posts. We have to read from it if it's germane to what we're talking about here. So we have a very lengthy post here on Truth Social from the president. I'm going to read from it. He addresses what we were covering yesterday. Shots fired on these two ships in the Strait of Hormuz. That wasn't nice, was it? The president writes. He announces his representatives are going to Islamabad, Pakistan. They're going to be there tomorrow evening for negotiations. Then he gets into who actually has closed the strait here. He says Iran has announced they're closing it. He says the U.S. has closed it because a blockade was already in place. Then he talks about a deal. We're offering a very fair and reasonable deal, the president writes, and I hope they take it because if they don't, the United States is going to knock out every single power plant, every single bridge in Iran. No more Mr. Nice Guy, President Trump writes. They'll come down fast, they'll come down easy, and if they don't take the deal, all caps, it will be my honor to do what has to be done, which should have been done to Iran by other presidents for the last 47 years. It's time for the Iranian killing machine, to end. John, let me ask you about the deal. The president, again, putting it in all caps there, and I think that's something that stymied me, perhaps Christina, over the course of the weekend. What deal is on the table, if any, what the president's talking about? We've heard about nuclear dust. We've heard about not having a nuclear program. Is it clear to you, as somebody who was in government for a long time, continues to follow all of this, what, in fact, the United States wants in a deal with Iran at this moment?
So the fundamentals of any deal with Iran, when it comes to their nuclear program, when it comes to ending this war, by the way, when it came to the deal that President Obama negotiated with the Iranians back in 2015, is some measure of sanctions relief that benefits the Iranian economy. That is what they are negotiating for. They fought a war to be able to preserve their nuclear program as it currently exists, to preserve their government. And the only way that they are going to stop resisting traffic going through the Strait is if they are given some sort of compensation that allows them to begin rebuilding their country. There's been tremendous amount of damage done, yes, to Iran's military, but also to many of Iran's civilian structures and requirements. And they're going to demand some sort of financial benefit from that, whether that's a toll going through the Strait or sanctions relief. They're under tremendous sanctions pressure from the United States. On the U.S. side, they want two things. They want traffic resuming through the Strait of Hormuz so the global economy can go back to at least a version of what it was before this war. And they would like Iran to part with 1,000 pounds, 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that Iran retains that give it a relatively short pathway to a nuclear weapon or to enough material for a nuclear weapon if they choose to do that. So those are the two sides. It's not actually all that complicated at the end of the day. And so what I would imagine is the United States is putting some versions of financial packages on the table that would benefit the Iranian economy. And if the Iranians decide it's enough, they may well take that deal. If they don't, I think they believe that time is on their side and the economic pain being caused by the war hurts the United States and its partners and allies more than it hurts Iran.
All right, John Feiner, thank you so much for joining us and for sticking with it through our dramatic reading of the president's tweets. We appreciate you.
I did yeoman's work there. I did my best. John Feiner, former Deputy National Security Advisor now at Columbia University. So let's just recap what we've learned here, Christina, over the course of the last few minutes. Steve Witkoff heading to Pakistan. Talks to begin, according to the president, tomorrow night. Could continue through what? Wednesday, he said.
That's right. And he's also threatening, if Iran doesn't take the deal, no more Mr. Nice Guy, he's going to be taking out bridges and other assets, which, already caused the president problem because hitting civilian infrastructure is a war crime in most circles. But to your question, what is the deal? What is the deal that's on the table? Is it just nuclear? Does it include the ballistic program as well, those rockets that Iran has been using to fire against Gulf allies? And what happens with the Strait?
And to use a phrase that Phil Crowther used, is the U.S. and is Israel singing from the same hymn page here going forward. Coming up in our next hour, we're going to speak with former Secretary of Defense Marc Esper. He's going to join us.
And what role can NATO play in helping bring peace to the region? That's straight ahead on Bloomberg this weekend.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. President Donald Trump speaking out about the war in Iran this morning as the Strait of Hormuz remains largely closed. The president telling Fox News U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, is headed to Pakistan for talks on Tuesday with representatives heading to Islamabad tomorrow night. The president posting on social media that if a deal is not made, he will, quote, do what has to be done. Well, tomorrow, many importers looking for tariff refunds are going to be able to begin filing their requests. Now, it comes after the Supreme Court ruled in February that the duties were illegal in the first place, involves a tool from U.S. Customs and Border Protection called the Consolidated Administrative and Processing of Entries, or let's just call it CAPE for short. Laura Curtis, Bloomberg's U.S. economy reporter, explains.
CAPE will take the first tranche of import requests and process them mostly automatically. They'll take just one entry number and the sum attached to it and sort of tie it all together, recalculate, and spit out the money that you should have paid.
Now, more complex refunds, they will take place at a later date. It could become the largest repayment by the U.S. government in its history. Well, as high school students, they near that May 1st decision day deadline to select a college, a new study reveals a hidden influence driving their choices. Researchers at Amherst College, they found that bad weather on a campus visit actually reduces a student's likelihood of applying. Applications dipped the most when it was too hot and when it was raining. Christina and David, I don't know, we went to Scranton, it was like -10, and she's going there. So,
I went to Cornell and it snowed and rained for, I think, 9/10 of my months there.
I went to school in Texas. It frosted once and everyone panicked.
Freaked out, yeah.
So it was good. It makes them bond. They can stay inside. Thanks, Lisa. All right, as we continue to monitor this fragile ceasefire in Iran, more than 40 European leaders are set to gather later this week in Cyprus to discuss de-escalation in the region and ensuring the freedom of navigation through the Strait. Yesterday, we sat down with European Special Envoy for Human Rights, Kajsa Ollongren. And we've been speaking a lot this morning about the confusion and contradictions over what is happening with the Strait of Hormuz. What is the mood there? What are people talking about? And what are European nations prepared to do?
Well, indeed, it is very fragile. The ceasefires in the Middle East are fragile, and also the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, now it's open, now it's closed. We don't know. So that is, I think, what people are discussing here as well, how to deal with this instability in the world. And from the European Union's point of view, I'm very much stressing the importance of cooperation and coordination and returning to the rules-based order where freedom of navigation is normal, where you don't threaten to attack civilian infrastructure, and where the people in the south of Lebanon are safe again. And I think it's very much top of mind, the situation in the Middle East, Iran, and broader.
Looking ahead to what we think will be possibly negotiations in Pakistan, again, between the U.S. and Iran on Monday, what is your take on the prospect of those talks happening at this point, based on people you've talked to and information you had, and the fruitfulness of those talks? You're a diplomat. You've been a diplomat for a long time. You know how much work usually goes into advancing these summits. That doesn't happen, and yet the U.S. seems, the president just spoke, and it seems like they're still bullish on there being a possibility of negotiations. What's your take on where that stands and whether or not a durable peace can be found?
Concretely, I do think we have been calling for de-escalation and for diplomacy. So it is very valuable that partners like Pakistan, but also Turkey, are actually trying to get the countries at a negotiating table. And we really sincerely hope that progress can be made. But also for Europe, this freedom of navigation and the Strait of Hormuz is very damaging to all the world. And we want to be part of the solution. So we will be happy. And there are several European countries who have expressed their willingness to support a mission in, keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. But it has to be done under the condition that there is a true ceasefire and that working towards a stable situation, and not just this situation that we're seeing this weekend, where you never know where you are.
I want to ask you more just about the fragility of that ceasefire, and it is a short one. I'm curious what you think needs to be in place for it to continue, and how optimistic you are indeed that this is going to last longer than 10 days.
Well, I think the whole world sees the necessity for this ceasefire. So in that way, everybody's pushing, I would say, in the same direction. At the same time, we have seen some very tough language coming from various sides, I would say. And we've also seen the consequences of the war in Iran, in the rest of the Middle East. So I'm very worried also about the ceasefire that was agreed between Israel and Lebanon at the coordination of the United States and the President Trump. It all seems very fragile, and it all seems to be a day-to-day situation, whereas what we need is a much longer perspective and genuine diplomatic efforts that will lead to something that is actually sustainable. And unfortunately, I try to be an optimist, but unfortunately, we're seeing more unpredictability than stability right now.
How do you do that, though? Because those kinds of multilateral deals, talks, collaborations require a level of trust, which folks I've spoken to, and correct me if I'm wrong, say that trust is really frayed, especially between European nations and the president right now. Is there a way to get back to not even normal, but a starting point for those negotiations, or is that still going to take time?
Well, it does take time. I do believe that the European Union and the European countries are showing their support to, the international system itself, to peace, to stability. And we're seeing the interest that we all have. It's no different between the United States and the European Union and also other countries in the world. We need stability in the world. Otherwise, people are going to suffer literally because of hunger, but also economically. It is harming all of us. So this moves in one direction. And I think the fact that the European Union is engaging and has put forward what it can do should be appreciated also by our American partners. And I sincerely hope that is the direction it's going to take. And of course, also it requires that countries in the Middle East also restrain themselves, that Israel restrains itself vis-a-vis their attacks on Hezbollah in Lebanon, because Lebanon is suffering hugely. And that also in Iran, there is a development towards this, they have to stop to suppress their own people, which is the cause of much of the trouble over there. So restraint, willingness and regaining trust is, I think, what the European Union aims for.
I'd like to ask you just about the international community's ability to police these ceasefires. So you've brought up the conflict in Lebanon, Israel's incursion there, this very fragile ceasefire. We know there have been violations of ceasefires in the past. Given how upended the world is right now, how strange the circumstances are, is there a robust enough apparatus in place to police these ceasefires going forward?
First of all, the ceasefire is not holding, unfortunately. And in Lebanon, the level of destruction and displacement of people is really horrendous. But what I do feel is very important is that there is engagement, that there are actually talks going on between Lebanon and Israel. So that is encouraging, and that is really a big step. And the second thing is that we cannot expect Lebanon to deal with this all on its own. Lebanon is a relatively small country and a very fragile country. So to disarm Hezbollah and to reclaim the monopoly on weapons by the Lebanese government is their intention, but they need support.
Before we let you go, I do want to ask you about NATO and the U.S. You've been a former defense minister. You're very involved in NATO. Are you concerned about Article 5 and about this president defending Article 5? It's not that necessarily the U.S. could pull out of NATO. The president can't do that unilaterally. But are you concerned that the president could de facto pull out of NATO just by not funding it, not collaborating, and not working with the alliance? How worried are you? How worried are your colleagues about that?
Well, I do believe we are sincerely worried, because NATO is not only about its capabilities, and we know that we as European countries need to do more. NATO is about deterrence, and deterrence is created by, the faith in all partners. If Article 5 were triggered, then every aggressor knows what will happen. If there is doubt about that, in the hearts and minds of the aggressors, then we are in trouble. So I do believe that it's extremely important to continue to engage with the United States, to show that the European countries are willing to take on more responsibility in NATO. But the very fact that there are comments about NATO being a paper tiger is certainly not helpful, and is not strengthening the NATO as an alliance at all.
All right, Mr. Ollongren, EU Special Representative for Human Rights, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And David, Kajsa was also a former deputy prime minister and a defense minister, so she's really experienced in doing all of the jobs, which is why I wanted to talk to her.
And fascinated to get her perspective, what's happening at that meeting. I know she has another one scheduled to take place a little later this week, but this gathering, yes, of European officials, but officials from the Middle East as well. And what struck me listening to her talk, again, this was yesterday, but I think very much is the case today, is about the fragility of the ceasefire that is in place right now. The level of confusion surrounding what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, and this kind of generalized sense of uncertainty about what's going to happen here in the days ahead. And so we have the president kind of doing his best, I suppose, in a social media post this morning to give us a bit more clarity on what's going to unfold in the coming days. And principally that has to do with what's going to take place in Islamabad starting tomorrow night.
Well, there's also been a lot of saber rattling from both sides. And we even heard the president, he had that event yesterday. He didn't take questions on Iran, but he talked about it at the top. And he kind of addressed this, and he said, oh, well, they have their own audience as well. And it's almost like, which we've seen in negotiations before, but there's this very loud, this is our side from the Iranians, this is the U.S. side. There's contentious social media posts. And we have to wonder if that's really what the discussions are, or if that is specifically for domestic audiences, domestic consumption, and the two are closer together, as Philip said, than we might know based on reading tweets, which is, always an interesting way to do diplomacy, but that's how it works these days.
I go back to what I asked John Feiner about, and that is this nuclear dust, as the president puts it. I mean, a huge question here is what happens to the nuclear material that's in Iran. And I'm reminded of a conversation that I had with retired Admiral James Stavridis a few weeks back. I said, what would it take for the U.S. to somehow spirit that material out of Iran? And he talked about how much military sophistication would be involved, but how much civilian manpower would be needed to do it. You would need experts on all of this material to go in with the military to make sure that it was carried out safely, responsibly. a huge issue that a lot of these leaders are thinking about right now.
So I think we were on the same bandwidth because I reached out to Corey Hinderstein at NTI, who's a nuclear expert, to ask a series of dumb questions. Like, I didn't even know what form this is in. And she was telling me the uranium is mostly in gas and it's stored in compressed pressurized canisters. She said, think a scuba tank, but a little larger. And to transport them safely, they have to put the canisters in like an overpack, which would protect them and contain them. But the other issue is these canisters are made kind of illegally by Iran, and they're not up to international standards. So she's not even sure if they would be stable enough to transport in that. I mean, to your point, it is a huge operation. It's going to take a lot of technical expertise. And as we've been talking about, up to this point, those technical experts have not really been in the fold. So they're negotiating something that may not be operational on the end of it, which is very concerning for people who are in the know and who've negotiated other agreements in the past.
And this stuff, this dust, this nuclear material, incredibly heavy as well, was another point that the Admiral made to me, that it would just be a huge undertaking to physically remove all of this from Iran. I look at this post that we have from the president, again, from just a few minutes ago, reiterating a lot of what he said before. The threat here remains, as he sees it, to strike at nuclear power plants and bridges. And Christina, as you rightly pointed out just a few minutes ago, were he to do that, there is a lot of international law that he would be in violation of. These would be significant human rights violations.
We've only got about 30 seconds before we've got to go to break, but there are new headlines coming in from the president on Fox News. He says he would be there for Iranian protesters. He says he has massive ammunition prepared against Iran. And he says Trump letter to tell Iran what is at risk if no deal. Also, Trump expected to release that letter today to Iranians.
President working the phones this morning. Fox News, the latest outlet he's talking to. Coming up here, we're going to talk about what it would take to retire comfortably. A step-by-step guide coming up next on Bloomberg This Week. Retiring comfortably is a cornerstone of the American dream, but that's getting more and more difficult as the cost of living keeps going up.
So what can we do right now to make sure we're on the path towards retiring rich, or at least comfortably rich? Bloomberg News personal finance reporter Suzanne Woolley is here. Is this even possible anymore? Is there a reasonable amount of money that you need? Is there a set dollar amount you need to retire comfortably?
Everyone wants to find some perfect dollar amount, and there are all sorts of surveys that come out, and they're like, oh, it's 1.2. No, now it's up to 1.4. But it's very personal. It depends, like, where you live, what your lifestyle is. Do you want to travel all over the world in style, or are you more chill and you just want to sort of, like, garden in your backyard? It's super personal. I know, right.
You've written this amazing article, and it's put together so wonderfully visually as this interactive, how you should think about retirement at different stages of your life as you approach retirement. So let's start at the beginning, when you're in your 20s and 30s, and the counsel there is start early and pick wisely.
Yes.
What should one be picking at a young age?
Well, one should be picking to dive into their 401k if it's available.
Put money in if you can.
Put money if you can.
That was the first advice I got at my real job from the old timers. They were like, max it out, do it now.
Yes.
And they were right?
Yeah, they were right. It's simple. Getting that money in early is going to make it so much easier to arrive at a comfortable retirement because it will be compounding. So it's really an incredibly powerful thing to do. You may not be able to get the full match, depending on how much you're making, and trying to get the match, if your company offers a match, is obviously amazing because, as everyone says, it's free money.
Yes.
But that is like a really important first step. And also, when you're doing that, realizing that you're young, you can take on a fair amount of risk. So you should be heavily into stocks. You do want to have some sort of emergency fund because you don't want to put everything in your 401k, and then if you have a sudden emergency, your car breaks down, something happens and you need a bunch of cash, you don't want to break into your 401k.
Don't do that. I've been told, as you've been told by old timers, I've been told likewise, don't break into the 401k unless it's like really worst case.
But I wonder if that advice holds in an economy when so many people are getting laid off. Like, I probably should have invested more, but I had periods of inconsistent work and I needed that liquidity. But you say it's good advice?
I mean, it's still good advice, but again, you have to adjust it to your situation. And I do think that given that sort of our jobs all seem a lot more tentative now, I still want to put money in the 401k, but I might want to try beefing up my emergency savings more than I might have 2 years ago.
Okay.
So now let's move on to somebody maybe in his 40s, 20-something years out from retirement. The counsel there is get guidance. So you may have been, hopefully you're putting money in.
Yes.
Up until this point, what do the conversations need to have happen at that point when you're in your 40s and thinking more realistically, I guess, about retirement?
I think right now, this age is a great time to try and find a good financial planner that you trust. It's not easy because there's no perfect way to find a financial planner. There just isn't. A lot of people find it through their friends who've been working with someone from a long time and they trust. There are certain certifications to look for that say this person is serious and has gone through training.
Does everyone need one? I never thought I had enough money to need a financial planner, quite frankly.
I mean, when you're very young, I'm not sure if you need them. The need becomes greater as you do get older in your 40s and 50s, and there are more tax situations, and you're planning for retirement, and you've got a lot of competing priorities for your money, and you need to sort of maybe be planning for, I mean, God forbid, long-term care down the road. These sort of things that you really need to plan for, in your 50s, say, that you can't wait until you're 65 to start focusing on them. So you need to sort of lay some groundwork. And I just find a good financial planner can help you put things in focus. It just helps you focus on what you have. You may be in better shape than you realize because you're not thinking, oh, I do have this base of Social Security, if we all believe it's going to be there.
Yes, I just said that before you came in. Yeah.
Hopefully, fingers crossed. You may be in better shape than you realize. It's not always going to be, oh my God, you're never going to retire.
You also talk about discipline meets dedication, stepping up your contributions, but things like maybe downsizing a little bit early. Mm-hmm. Why is that, and what does that look like?
It could get you ahead a little bit. It could, move you along the path a little bit faster if, say, you downsized a home and you could pay for your next one in cash and had some left over to put into your savings. That was one financial planner I spoke with talked about. Doing that earlier rather than later. Some people don't realize that homes can be really expensive to maintain. Yeah. All the money you put into it, like the tree maintenance, the boiler breaks, the this, the that, it all adds up and you don't even realize.
Tanks. My parents had to replace a line to their propane tank this week. Yes. It was $800.
Yes, it's all stuff like this and you don't really realize it. So, if you downsize to a smaller house, you may be able to have, you may still have issues, but hopefully they will be smaller issues.
All right, so that's like 10 years out, 5 years out, you say to practice retirement.
Yeah.
What does that mean? That sounds wonderful.
I know.
To me at this stage.
I agree.
I really liked that. I mean, one idea is, we all think there are a bunch of things we want to do in retirement. We want to, start volunteering at our local ASPCA or various sort of hobbies. Like, start easing into that now, in a way. Go to your local ASPCA on Sundays, maybe, walk a dog for a little while. Get to know the organization and know if that's really sort of what you want to do. So test it out that way. And the less... the not as fun part, maybe, is to, if you figured out with your planner, and the planners can be this great in forcing you to figure out a budget, because creating a budget is just awful.
Nobody likes
it. Sorry.
Maybe the planners do.
Maybe they do, but I found it torturous. Yeah. And, so they can sort of help you come up with that amount. And if you sort of 6 months... try to live on that amount.
Yeah.
Are you being realistic? Are you forgetting about, your huge dry cleaning bills? Or are you, so just 6 months or so, trying to live on what you think you can live on in retirement can be really instructive.
Yeah.
But it can also be, I don't want to say fun because it's not, but it was amazing to me in times of when I had to buckle down a little bit. You can probably live on a lot less than you're living on and not drastically change your lifestyle, right? Like you can still have a good retirement, maybe just not order out every single day and things like that.
Yeah, you just sort of, you spend more mindfully. And there are a lot of things. I mean, I subscribe to way too many Substacks and way too many things. I could easily lop out a couple hundred a month just by doing that, So there are a lot of little things like that on the edges.
You may not need Netflix and Hulu and Disney Plus and Amazon Prime and Apple Music and Spotify. Not that I have all of those.
I know. Yeah, it's true. It's true. So there's more that you can play with than you probably think.
Let me ask you lastly just about, you mentioned at the beginning when you're young, maybe you're willing to take on more risk or you can take on more risk. A lot of folks just put money in these targeted funds, guessing the date at which they're going to retire. A good idea to do that, or does it kind of inure you to some of the decisions you're suggesting people have to make?
Interesting. I am generally a fan of target date funds. A lot of us are auto-enrolled in them when we join our plan, and which I think is good because a lot of people, if they aren't auto-enrolled, way back in history, you used to be put into cash. And people would just sort of sit there. So target date funds are a good way to get a diversified portfolio. I don't think they're all as low fee as I would like. And I think that it would be great if people actually paid more attention to what's in their target date fund, because most people just sort of set it and forget it, which can be a good strategy in a way. You know, you don't want to get too tied up in your money and freak out about it all the time. But a lot of people don't even know, like, how much of my target date fund is in stocks, how much is in bonds.
What the mix is.
Yeah, and it's just good to be educated.
Do you think you're ever going to fully retire?
I don't think so.
I wasn't getting that vibe off of you. We did another story about how people aren't really fully retiring as much anymore. So I was just curious.
No, I don't actually want to. I really love working. I would hope that I would continue writing and find other projects to do. But, you know, the concept of being able to travel when I want to, where I want to, is great.
I support that. And I support you coming on whenever you like.
Thank you.
Suzanne, thank you. It's great. Thank you very much. Suzanne Woolley, a personal finance reporter here at Bloomberg News. I mentioned that interactive. You can check it out at bloomberg.com/wealth. It is a very cool interactive. I commended it to folks during the course of that interview, but to go through it and see sort of where you should be along the stages is very well laid out and I think very useful probably for a lot of people.
It made me think I need to think about this and possibly
get that planner maybe.
Get a money manager. Do you have a money manager?
I do not.
All right, well.
But I'm not advocating for not having one.
No, I didn't take it that way.
I just feel lazy.
To think about.
I just feel generally lazy about my
Same.
professional and personal predicament.
Also, denial is fine. I just like it. I'll worry about it some other year.
All right.
All right. Coming up in our next hour, Marlin Stutzman, Republican congressman from Indiana, is going to join us live. He's on the House Finance and Budget committees.
You can explore live streaming news and interviews, all our Bloomberg TV shows, documentaries, reporter analysis, and more. Find it in one place. Check out Bloomberg.com/videos at Bloomberg.com. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm David Gura with Christina Ruffini. We have been focused a lot this weekend on private credit. Yesterday we spoke with Bloomberg's Danny Berger, Puck's Bill Cohen about how worried they think we should be about problems in the space. And Bill said he thinks fears are likely overblown.
That's right. In this weekend's forecast newsletter, Felix Salmon, Bloomberg senior writer for Ideas and Culture, makes a similar argument, writing private credit is not a financial crisis in the making. All right, Felix, I have to tell you guys, I didn't really know the phrase private credit about 2 months ago, and now I feel like it's like infiltrated everything in my feed. How bad is this? Do I need to care about blue owls, and why aren't you freaking out?
So, yes, this is the problem with the financial sector becoming large and shadowy and not really big public companies, although technically Blue Owl is a public company. People don't really know what's going on, and private credit is this massive trillion-dollar asset class, which has been very happy for many years making loans and getting interest payments.
And this is basically just a loan you don't get from a bank, right?
This is a loan that businesses borrow directly from the people with the money rather than going through an intermediary like a bank.
Okay.
A bank needs to fund itself through deposits or whatever, and these intermediaries have the cash. So they just directly, if I'm a very rich person or an insurance company, I'll just lend money directly to private equity-backed companies, and they will take the money and then they will pay me back over time. And it's just a bilateral relationship. There's nothing really systemically dangerous going on there. And that's why you haven't heard about it for the past 2 years.
Okay.
And now, over the past couple of months, you have heard about it because numbers have started going down rather than up, right? And so there are worries, something SaaS, something cockroaches. People worry about it's credit, right? Sometimes loans don't get repaid.
Yeah.
And people are realizing that there's credit risk in private credit, and so the values of those loans might be lower than 100 cents on the dollar. And that's it. That's the entire story. But because we haven't been paying attention for the past couple of years, and because we do have long enough memories to remember 2008, when things we hadn't been paying attention to wound up causing a massive financial crisis, we see like, oh my God, $1 trillion here, and we haven't been paying attention, and prices are going down, and credit, and we're like, is there going to be a financial crisis? And so my thing is to just say, no, there is not going to be a financial crisis. There's all manner of things to worry about in this planet, but a financial crisis is not one of them.
And why is that? Is it because it's confined to such a small space in the broader financial system? What gives you the confidence to say that despite people wringing their hands and worrying about cockroaches and other insects and vermin, this isn't going to be a big deal?
So there are two things that characterize credit crises. Sorry, let me rephrase that. There are two things that characterize financial crises. One is when you have massive leverage, right? So Lehman Brothers was 30-1 levered and that kind of thing. So if you have, or the subprime mortgages, people would put down 4%, which is 25-1 leverage. So when you have massive leverage like that and you get a small decline in prices, people get wiped out, you get bankruptcies, and it's often people who are, blameless small individuals, and that's bad. The second thing that causes a financial crisis is when you have assets that people think are risk-free but turn out to have a bunch of risk in them. Bank deposits are a really good example of this. If I put a bunch of money in the bank, I'm like, that's money in the bank, that's safe. And then the bank goes bust and I don't have that money, that is a crisis. Or if I buy a bunch of AAA rated CMBS in 2006, I buy that because it's AAA rated. There's zero default risk. And then if suddenly there's default risk, all hell breaks loose. Neither of those two things pertain to private credit. Private credit is credit. Everyone knows that there's credit risk. Everyone knows that there's default risk. So no one thinks that it's risk-free. And the amount of leverage in these things is small. It's like maximum 2-1.
But you've seen a little bit of panic, and the phrase I keep getting told is like retail investors are the problem. Like retail investors are panicking.
Yep.
Explain to us why that is, and they're capped at how much they can take out of some of these funds, right?
So the general vibe, if you look at things like there's these animals called publicly traded BDCs, which you don't need to worry about too much. But I
can't. I'm on acronym overload. I'm learning as many as I can, but I'm not learning that one today. But
so don't learn that one. But the point is that if you look at the vibe in the markets, the vibe in the markets is that these private credit loans are worth less than 100 cents on the dollar right now because people are worried about default risk. And if you're a retail investor in private credit, and there are some, it's not a massive part of the private credit world, but it is a significant part of the private credit world. If you're a retail investor in private credit, in most of these vehicles, you have the ability to take your money out at 100 cents on the dollar.
Yeah.
The market is telling you these things are worth 80 cents on the dollar. And your contract is saying you get to withdraw at 100 cents on the dollar. Even if you're not panicking, why would you not do that? It's free money. So a whole bunch of perfectly rational, non-panicking investors are saying, yes, please, I'll put my name on the list to take money out at 100 cents on the dollar. The funds, because they are deliberately designed to be illiquid, say, look, we can only give you back in aggregate among all of the investors 5% of your money each quarter, so not everyone gets their money back, and then people start to panic. But this is a feature, not a bug.
We have 30 seconds left. If this doesn't end with a bang, more so a whimper, what does that look like? If we don't get a crisis, how bad could this be?
A few people lose, like institutional investors lose money on some of their private credit investments. Small and medium-sized businesses lose access to an avenue of funding that they've had for the past few years.
So you're just not that worried?
Not that worried.
It's not going to be a crisis.
All right, you heard it first.
Felix Salmon, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, you can read more about this story in the Forecast newsletter. Subscribe at Bloomberg.com/newsletters.
Coming up on 9 a.m. in New York, we're going to speak with former Defense Secretary Marc Esper, coming up on Bloomberg This Weekend, which continues right now.
Coming up on Bloomberg This Weekend, shipping in the Strait of Hormuz at a near standstill.
They wanted to close up the Strait again, as they've been doing for years, and they can't blackmail us.
As the hours tick down to the end of the ceasefire just days away, Trump's former Defense Secretary Marc Esper joins us live.
And President Trump's pick to lead the Federal Reserve heads to Capitol Hill. The questions Kevin Warsh will face as Trump's feud with Jerome Powell continues.
Plus, Blastoff. A Blue Origin rocket just landed with its first reusable booster. What it means in its competition with SpaceX.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We are coming to you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We are here, of course, with Lisa Mateo. It is Sunday, April 19th. A lot of developments coming out of the White House this morning about the state of play with Iran, with just days to go until that ceasefire expires. President Trump is telling Fox News this morning that Special Envoy Steve Witkoff will be heading to Pakistan tomorrow for negotiations to start on Tuesday.
And in a post last hour, the president saying the U.S. is offering a very fair and reasonable deal. The president goes on to say, I hope they take it, because if they don't, the United States is going to knock out every single power plant and every single bridge in Iran. No more Mr. Nice Guy, the president concludes. He ended that post with, it's time for the Iran killing machine to end. Lisa Mateo has been paying attention to all of these conversations the president has been having here with news outlets over the course of the morning and other headlines. Let's go to Lisa next.
You gotcha. And let's get you up to date with the Strait of Hormuz. We'll start there, where shipping remains at a near standstill after Iran reversed its decision to reopen the waterway. Iran now says it will remain closed until the end of the U.S. blockade on Iranian ports. Bloomberg reporting multiple ships, including at least 9 tankers, have since reversed course. Earlier Saturday, Iran fired on at least 2 ships trying to transit the waterway. India says it's deeply concerned about 2 shooting incidents involving 2 ships flying its flag in the Strait of Hormuz. The Wall Street Journal says that the U.S. military preparing to board an Iran-linked oil tanker in the coming days and seize those commercial ships in international waters. Now, meanwhile, there are signs that the ceasefire in Lebanon could be in jeopardy. The IDF says it eliminated a, quote, terrorist cell operating near its soldiers in southern Lebanon. In other news, North Korea, they launched ballistic missiles toward waters off its east coast. Authorities in South Korea say multiple unidentified missiles, they were fired from the Sinpo area of North Korea Sunday morning. The missiles believed to have fallen near the east coast of the Korean peninsula. And Pope Leo opened the 3rd leg of his 4-nation trip through Africa and Angola yesterday. The pontiff challenged its leaders to, quote, break the cycles of interest that have exploited Africa for centuries. Now, during his travels, Pope Leo also commented about his back and forth with President Donald Trump.
The talk that I gave at the prayer meeting for peace a couple days ago was prepared 2 weeks ago, well before the president ever commented on myself and on the message of peace that I am promoting.
The Pope will be in Angola today for further scheduled masses. So he has a whole lineup of things. He's doing a real large tour.
So thank you very much. Definition of a feud, I think, is people going back and forth with one another. I'm not sure the Pope is interested in engaging with the president.
He seems to be a fan of de-escalation.
De-escalation
yes.
here, at least in this circumstance. All right, within the last hour, President Trump has confirmed U.S. negotiators are heading to Pakistan tomorrow for meetings that will start on Tuesday. And the Strait of Hormuz remains a key sticking point between the U.S. and Iran, as the key energy choke point remains closed. Back with us is Bloomberg's White House correspondent Courtney Subramanian. And Courtney, if your phone rings during the course of this interview, the president has talked to Jonathan Karl, he's talked to Fox News, he's talked to MS Now. If your phone rings and you need to take it, nothing here on mine as well, take the call if you need to. We will proceed without you. Until then, though, you have been synthesizing all that the president has been saying in these phone interviews. Give us the latest on what we know of these meetings, the second round of talks that are going to be taking place here in Pakistan as the week begins.
Yeah, as you mentioned, he's given a series of interviews this morning. He's taken to Truth Social. He's trying to set the tone of what to expect in the coming days. And that is that Special Envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner will return to Islamabad tomorrow evening for talks. He has just told MS Now that J.D. Vance is not attending those talks for security reasons. I have actually, while we're sitting here, texting the vice president's staff to try and confirm that. But I think all of this just underscores in the last 72 hours just how much whiplash we're seeing here, and just underscores the unpredictable nature of this conflict and the erratic and sometimes contradictory messaging we've seen from the president. I think it's important to remember that Friday, he told us that an agreement was all but agreed to, which included concessions that Iran had never publicly agreed to. He even told ABC that he trusted the Iranians. And then Of course, he crucially left the blockade of the Strait in place until an agreement was finalized, which prompted Tehran to close the Strait again and set this whole situation off. And now we're seeing him again threaten Iranian power plants and bridges if they don't take the deal. Again, escalating the rhetoric ahead of negotiations, which is, of course, a tactic we've seen him use over and over again in this conflict.
Courtney, one of the things I found interesting is having covered the first Trump administration, as we all did, when they pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal the first time, and even on the campaign trail leading up to that, the president was so critical of Iran, saying they couldn't be trusted. They could never be trusted to get into any kind of a nuclear deal and stick to it. They couldn't be trusted as negotiators. Where has that changed? Why has that changed? And why is the president suddenly willing to take them at their word in these negotiations in pursuit of a deal that seems like it's going to look very much like the one he pulled out of in the first place?
That's a great question. I do think that the president is looking for an off-ramp. I think he is realizing the economic repercussions are really bearing out, both globally but here at home, as we look ahead to November and we see Americans really start to feel the economic pain of this at the gas pump, right? And so this time, this is a situation of his making, and he is looking for any opportunity to bring this conflict to an end and move on. And so I think that has allowed him to sort of vacillate between, this escalating rhetoric where he's really ramping up pressure, but then taking the Iranians at their word that they're going to come to the table and agree to a deal. But as you know, the Iranians are very good at dragging out negotiations.
All right, Courtney Zimmern, our White House correspondent, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Joining us now is former Defense Secretary Marc Esper. He served in President Trump's first administration. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being with us. The first question I want to ask you is, when you look at this negotiating team, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, it looks like Vice President Vance, we're learning this morning, will not be going for the second round of negotiations. Do you think they're up to the task?
Well, they have the president's trust. So in that regard, they are up to the task, though I assume that the Iranians will interpret the vice president not coming as a downgrading of this next round of talks, which could be the last round of talks for any time soon. And so they may pull back on their delegation, which I think it's going to be hard to get a deal done, at least a deal in principle, for that reason. And then if you're going to believe the president, then the president says the attacks will begin, following that, if the talks fail. If they don't sign the deal, I think is what he literally said. If they don't sign the deal on Tuesday before the ceasefire, then he's going to go after their energy, after their infrastructure, after their power plants.
Mr. Secretary, I want to ask you about the chronology here. So we had the announcement from the Iranian foreign minister that the Strait was open on Friday morning. Then a few hours later, we saw a great deal of confusion sown as the president indicated that blockade was going to stay in place. And that's kind of where I want to go with you, is the role of that blockade going forward here, the importance of it as you see it. Is it something that you see as being negotiable here? Do you think it will be negotiated upon at those meetings in Islamabad?
Well, I think, first of all, part of the blockade with regard to Iran, when the foreign minister came out, what he did say is it was lifted, but he mentioned the conditions. And the conditions, of course, were still that shipping had to follow this new route, which was close to the Iranian coastline between their islands, and that it would be managed by the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. But that wasn't reported as loudly. It was just that they had opened it. And then, of course, there was a lot of friction within Iran, with the hardliners saying that the foreign minister had overstepped his bounds. It was the wrong message. And in fact, they were going to do all those things plus charge tolls, and that caused the counter reaction. Look, I think President Trump putting the blockade on Iran, a few days ago, was a smart move. I think, there's no reason why Iran should be allowed to reap the benefits of oil revenues coming out of the Gulf and sustain its fight, while shipping from friendly countries is not allowed to go. So I thought that was smart. I think that's what put pressure on the Iranians. And I was a little surprised that he didn't lift it when they lifted it. But nonetheless, we are where we are this morning, with both sides clamping down on control of the Strait, and it effectively bottled up at this point in time once again.
And what do you make of the president's renewed threats here this morning? He says he will go after every single power plant and every single bridge in Iran. No more Mr. Nice Guy. Do you consider that a war crime? And what does it mean for the state as a whole? David was asking earlier, wouldn't that just lead to a failed state if there's no infrastructure left, there's no power center left, there's no ability to have a democracy in Iran?
Well, first of all, that's his negotiating style, right? To threaten to amp up the rhetoric and maybe force them to step down or at least reconsider their position, the Iranians. And so he's going back to where he was just about a week ago, I think, in terms of timing. So that's not surprising. This question with regard to war crimes, it all depends on how the planners, the targeteers, and the lawyers look at different targets, whether it's a power plant or a bridge or a highway, and how close its connection is to the military. So, for example, if you have a power plant sitting on a military base, powering that base, then it's a legitimate target. As you get further and further away from such direct connectivity, then it becomes more dubious. And so I think the military is going to have to work through all those different issues, case by case, target by target, to come to that final understanding, if indeed that is where the military goes in this next phase.
I think the thing that has led to a lot of the fogginess we've experienced over the last 36 or 48 hours is just not being able to get a sense of the degree to which what the president is saying the Iranians have agreed to is in fact what they have agreed to. And you know well the difficulties of engaging in any kind of diplomacy or negotiations with the Iranians. Of course, you were in the first term when the president pulled out of the JCPOA. Talk a bit about that, if you would, the way the U.S. can verify what, in fact, the Iranians are actually saying they're doing, what they have done. Yes, perhaps this will be haggled out over the table there in Islamabad, but leading up to it, how do we know what we know, to ask a very basic and cumbersome question?
Yeah, look, it's tough. I mean, obviously, the president raises expectations with some of the things he says. Maybe he's picking up spot reports from his advisors, which maybe is missing some nuance. But nonetheless, the expectation was real. Or as the president's been saying, that we're very, very close to a deal, that they want it really badly. And then what you hear coming out of Iran, as recently as the last 24 hours, where the lead negotiator, Speaker Ghalibaf, has said, yes, progress was made in Islamabad last week, but we are far from there are significant differences between our negotiating positions. Now, he's the lead negotiator, and I'm paraphrasing. But that shows there's a much bigger gap. Now, look, I'll also say that what the Iranians say publicly to the West and what they say privately to their own people are two different things, because they're trying to manage a domestic audience. So it is hard to parse through what's going on. But when I look at each side's negotiating positions, going back to the 15 points proposed by President Trump and the 10 points proposed by the Iranians, I just see few areas of agreement. The big issues, there's a major disagreement when it comes to nuclear enrichment, when it comes to returning the nuclear fuel, when it comes to what's going to be the future of the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, when we talked yesterday about what the foreign minister said and what the IRGC is saying, is the new normal they want to establish is that they have sovereignty over the Strait, and they will control and manage who goes through, and they will impose tolls, much like what happens at the Panama Canal. And that's clearly something we, the West, cannot tolerate. So I think this is just going to have to play out over the coming days. I still see the positions, based on my historical understanding of where both sides are, as too far apart to get a deal here in the next 48, 72 hours.
Do you think this conflict was a strategic blunder by the U.S., given that Iran has now figured out, even if it gives up its nuclear program, it has a more powerful card to play in closing the Strait?
At least economically, yeah.
You know, you can't tally the score until the game's over. And, right now, obviously, we've had considerable progress at the military level, which with regard to taking down the military objectives of defeating their Navy, degrading their air defense, their Air Force, so forth and so on. But at this point in time, at the strategic level, we know that Iran is still refusing to yield to our nuclear demands. And that was ostensibly the reason why we got into this conflict 8 weeks ago. If you recall, in Geneva, Witkoff and Kushner said, look, the Iranians aren't serious on the nuclear issue. We need to try something different. And that's when Operation Epic Fury was launched. So,
but would you have greenlit this operation in your time? If the president came to you when you were running the Pentagon, would you have said this was a good idea?
Well, this happened at times during my tenure. I would say, look, these are the things we can do, but wars are unpredictable. Once you get into them, it's easy to get in, but hard to get out. And I talk about this a lot in my memoir, about how we would have these discussions, and it would be myself and the chairman warning about getting into a conflict without positioning troops in advance, without being prepared for a ground war, and without being prepared for all these other consequences we're seeing. So I thought that was my job. A, to prepare plans to go to war, make sure the force is ready, but B, give my best advice with regard to the pros and cons. And There's been documentation about the presence of viruses being at various positions on this with regard to getting it. But the view is he felt emboldened after what happened last June with Midnight Hammer, with the Venezuela operation, and was maybe convinced that if he did this operation, decapitated the government, they might fall. And clearly it didn't.
Let me ask you lastly about Lebanon, which of course has been such a crucial issue here. And we have headlines this morning from Israel's defense minister saying he and Benjamin Netanyahu have instructed the IDF to act with all force from the ground, from the air, even during the ceasefire, to protect our soldiers in Lebanon from any threat. A crucial issue here for the U.S. is the degree to which they and Israel are going to be on the same page. How big a challenge is that going to be going forward here?
Well, Israel clearly has different goals than we have when it comes to both Iran and Lebanon. And the Lebanon issue has been dragging on for the Israelis as long as Hezbollah has been in existence, since the early 1980s. So, and this isn't the first time that there's been some type of agreement or commitment by the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah, to move them back up north. So look, I think Israel clearly wants to go in and push the Hezbollah further north of the Litani River, disarm them once again, take out their leadership. But they're playing to President Trump's fiddle right now because Trump wants a deal. And to get the deal, he had to push them to have a ceasefire with the Lebanese, with Hezbollah, to be more specific, in order to get the Iranians to back down a little bit. So I think the question will be is, if the ceasefire between the United States and Iran breaks down in 3 days, will the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel also break down? That'll be an important point to watch.
I mean, very quickly, what do you think will happen? Do you think it will break down?
Where the rhetoric is this morning, I see it very hard to get an agreement in 48 hours. So my sense is the president may be forced to launch some type of military tax to live up to what he said, rather than kind of yielding or extending the agreement. But who knows? We'll see.
Thank you so much for taking time. Former Defense Secretary Marc Esper joining us this morning.
He's been more a sacred oath there on the bookshelf behind him. Coming up, Republican Congressman Marlin Stutzman is going to join us live on Bloomberg this weekend. He sits on the House Financial Services Committee. They, in the House, will be watching what's happening across Capitol Hill closely on Wednesday, when Kevin Warsh takes the hot seat in front of the Senate Banking Committee for confirmation hearing to be the next Federal Reserve Chair. Of course, Christina, so much uncertainty surrounding all of that, given the position of Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina, who, as the investigation into Jerome Powell continues, is still adamant he will not approve any nominees going forward. All that's to come here on Bloomberg This Weekend on Bloomberg TV, radio, and Bloomberg.com.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. And Havana's nightlife falls dark as its energy crisis under the U.S. oil embargo deepens. Cuba has been in this economic freefall ever since the United States cut off oil shipments to the island from Venezuela and Mexico in January. Now, meanwhile, President Donald Trump ramping up pressure on Havana. The New York Times reporting the Trump administration sent a senior delegation to Cuba last week to address the humanitarian crisis on the island. Now, the U.S. officials reportedly told Cuba's leadership that it had a narrow window of time to make certain economic and political changes. More aggravation may be in store for airline travelers in the coming months. Higher jet fuel prices, they have carriers worldwide increasing cancellations, grounding planes. Prediction data from Cirium, it shows global capacity for May has been reduced, with all but one of the 20 largest airlines cutting flights. And hundreds of fake pro-Trump avatars are popping up on social media. The New York Times is reporting many feature attractive AI-generated MAGA influencers posting about the, quote, radical left and America first. Several accounts already have more than 35,000 followers. Some of those posts, guys, are reaching more than 500,000 views. So people are believing them and taking them as they go.
The midterms, not just half a year.
Yes,
away.
exactly.
It's coming up fast.
Yet another thing we're going to have to figure out how to navigate and keep track of.
Yes.
Thanks for that great news, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa. New developments this morning. President Trump talking to several news organizations, saying he's sending representatives to Pakistan for talks to end the Iran war. Negotiations set to start on Tuesday. All the while, he's also threatening to strike civilian infrastructure if Tehran doesn't agree to a deal. Joining us now is Indiana Congressman Marlin Stutzman, who joins us now from the 3rd District in Indiana. Let me start with a broad question, if I could. Thank you very much for being here. I'm curious how all of this is reverberating around Fort Wayne and its surrounding environs. What are your constituents saying to you? What questions do they have about this conflict as it enters its 8th week?
Yeah, good morning. First of all, thanks for having me. You know, that's a really good question because as I talk to constituents, it usually depends on the age. The older folks are that understand or remember the context of Iran and what they have done over the last 40 years. Many of them are like, finish the job. We need to get rid of this extreme ideology. And then the younger folks that, haven't lived through the 40 years of turmoil with Iran, they're the ones that typically say, we got to get out of there. President Trump said no new wars. So it's kind of a generational approach more than anything.
I want to ask you, though, with that 47 years of context, the reason this administration pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal the first time is because they said Iran couldn't be trusted. Can Iran be trusted to stick to anything that's agreed to in the room in Pakistan with these negotiators?
The IRGC cannot be trusted. They have shown that over and over. On Friday, we're being told by the Iranian regime that the Straits are going to be open. President Trump announced the Straits are going to be open. And then within 48 hours, it's not. And so, I think that there's a real power struggle going on inside the IRGC. The prime minister or the parliamentarian leader is being kind of the lead negotiator. But it seems like after he makes some sort of a deal with President Trump, he's being pulled back by the more fundamentalists that are in that camp. And these are true believers in the ideology that, they're willing to die for their religion. And I think that's also the big struggle within Islam is that there is, you have the modern and moderate Muslims who are moving forward. You look at the countries in the Gulf states and in other parts of the world. And here you have this extreme regime in Iran that continues to show, they're willing to die and want the infidel to be gone. And so I think that's really the struggle that's going on right now. And you look at even Turkey. Turkey's saying, hey, we want to see a deal done. And Turkey seemed to be supportive. Other countries in that region have been supportive. Iran is the one that's standing alone by themselves.
Let me go back to your constituents, if I could. You mentioned that younger constituency here that maybe voted for the president because they wanted him to take a less aggressive approach overseas. They're watching all of this unfold as you are and looking at the bill as it comes due and the prospects for this becoming a more and more expensive conflict. We've seen what the Pentagon has floated, the amount of money that they need on an emergency basis, how big they want the Pentagon budget to become. You sit on the House Budget Committee. What is your appetite, sir, for continuing to fund this war? What constraints do you need to see put in place to keep funding it the way in which the White House wants it to be funded?
Well, I think we need to finish the job, and I don't think we want to short ourselves at all when it comes to that funding. I mean, sitting on the Budget Committee, we look at the reports every day. The military is not the issue of our deficit spending. It's emergency spending that typically is what drives our debt up when we don't budget appropriately. When we do these extreme supplementals, during the COVID era, during emergencies, whether, natural disasters, things like that. Those are the ones that really drive the debt up rather than sticking to the budget that we passed. We actually did cut some real spending this past in 2025. So, we can do it. We've got to fix a lot of things within our federal government. There's a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse. That doesn't fix the problems entirely. We still need some reforms. And there's bipartisan groups. I'm part of one that we're looking at the budget in a bipartisan way and how can we get this debt and deficit, back down under comfortable levels rather than these high levels that we haven't seen since World War II.
So you are comfortable then with this $1.5 trillion figure, effectively doubling the size of the Pentagon's budget. You think that that's a reasonable request, reasonable change for Pentagon funding going forward?
I want to exactly understand what it is. A lot of these are one-time expenditures. And so, the 1.5 can't consistently maintain itself. And I shared that with the Pentagon this last week that, 1.5, you're asking for, almost $500 billion more. But a lot of it goes towards, drone capability, F-47s, ships, which we have been behind on. So a lot of this goes towards a one-time new projects in modernizing our military. And I think that's something that we need to, kind of separate out and explain to the American people what this big plus up is actually for, and that it's not just for military spending in perpetuity. We can't afford that. We've got to get a good handle, and there is waste in the military. And I mentioned that to them, that we've got to be sure in the military that we're not wasting taxpayer dollars if we're going to go after the waste, fraud, and abuse and other programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and other programs.
But Congressman, you said you want, the administration to finish the job. If they came to you and said, we need this whole $1.5 trillion to finish the job, would you say yes, carte blanche, or would you say we still need to look at this?
Well, I don't think we need that much. In fact, any supplemental for Iran there's talks around 100 billion to 200 billion at most. In fact, the Pentagon is telling us that, they think they can do it within the appropriations that we did in the big, beautiful bill. So this 1.5 would actually be long-term military, capabilities, especially, Golden Dome and the new technology coming forward. So I don't think that this is going to cost that much. And no, I would not approve 1.5 trillion just towards the conflict in Iran.
Let me ask you about the hearing that's going to take place on Wednesday in the Senate, not in the House. Kevin Warsh is going to have his time before the Senate Banking Committee to testify in advance of his nomination being voted upon. And of course, there's a lot surrounding that adds some uncertainty to this, whether Senator Tom Tillis is going to allow that to go through. He says he won't. I imagine you'll be listening as a spectator, as the two of us will be. What are you listening for, and what's your sense of how this nomination is likely to proceed? Are you sympathetic with Senator Tillis in what he's saying?
Well, I think if there's anybody that wants to see Jerome Powell leave his position, it's President Trump. And, whatever it takes, if the investigation is warranted and is needed, then that's one thing. But if it's just to poke him in the eye, then, I think that's one of those things that just like, he's done. Let's move on. Let's get to Kevin's nomination and let's get a new Fed chair. And but again, there's a lot of information that folks have been looking at that say, there needs to be a deeper look behind Mr. Powell. And so I think that, we just need to be fair, to be practical and be reasonable and understand that if there is a warrant, or I'm sorry, if there's an investigation warranted, then that should be followed through on. But if it's not, then let's move on. I mean, the quicker we can move on and have a new Fed chair, I'm looking forward to that.
Is that your preference, sir? You think that this is a fight the president should let go and just move on so that he can ultimately get his end goal, which is a new Fed chair?
Well, I think the end goal should be to get the new Fed chair as quickly as possible. But anytime there is abuse of funds or misappropriation of funds, those are the questions that are being asked. And I think that every person needs to be held accountable, whether you're the outgoing federal, the Fed chair, or if you're the incoming Fed chair. I mean, we're all human beings that need to be held accountable. And if there's real problems here that need to be looked into, those should be. But if it's not, then let's move on and let's get to the new Fed chair. And there's a lot of work to do to grow this economy.
In the couple minutes we have left, let me come full circle and ask you about your constituents once again, ask about you as well. You're a fourth-generation farmer. We were reporting earlier this morning that tomorrow folks can begin filing for money back based on tariffs after that Supreme Court decision. Talk, if you could, about the level of uncertainty that farmers in particular are facing amidst this layer of uncertainty about where trade policy is going forward. What's your message to the president about the way this trade policy should be engineered and implemented for farmers particularly who are facing so much uncertainty?
Yeah, well, I love to talk about Northeast Indiana, my district. It's a great place to live and raise a family. Farmers have had it tough, but I grew up in a family farm, and farming is always difficult. But and when you throw on a couple of these new policies, whether it's tariffs, of course, the energy issues, fertilizers being bottled up in the Straits of Hormuz, that does affect all the commodity prices. And if there's one thing I know, that farmers really are kind of at the mercy of the markets, and often have to we have to plan ahead, and that's one of the things that a lot of farmers have done. They've already locked in their pricing on fertilizers, they've locked their pricing in on fuels, and selling corn, soybeans, other commodities that they produce. But it's been tough. I think a lot of folks believe that President Trump is doing the right thing by resetting the trade policies with China in particular that have needed to happen for a long time. We know China plays a different game, but it has been rough. And I think that some of the issues that could easily be addressed that would help offset this is, of course, there's a farm bill hopefully coming to the floor this next week that gives farmers some risk tools to use for management. Labor is another issue that needs to be addressed at some point for agriculture. So I know that President Trump is very in tune with agriculture and to the farmer across this country. And we understand the long-term ramifications of President Trump's policies when it comes to tariffs. My hope is that we can move away from income tax and go towards a tariff tax base structure to really let the American farmer keep more of their own money.
So before we let you go quickly, you said you understand the long-term ramifications, and I'm sure you're hoping your constituents are. But in the short term, have those policies, has this conflict made life harder for those people you were just talking about? And is that something that you are concerned about going into the midterms?
Well, yeah, I mean, they have. But at the same time, the Big Beautiful Bill did a lot to help the American farmer and rancher. You know, we are eliminating the inheritance tax. That's a big issue for farm families that are trying to pass on the farm from one generation to the other. Keeping the taxes low, that was a big deal as well. That's been very helpful, especially, you know, to those pass-through entities that most farmers are set up as. And of course, the energy policy, rural development, rural focus, rural America, it's tough. It always has been tough, but that's okay. You know, many of us choose to be here because we like the independence, we like our maybe our privacy and a little calmer lifestyle, but at the same time, we want to see a strong, vibrant economy when it comes to agriculture and manufacturing in the rural areas.
Thank you so much, sir. Representative Marlin Stutzman from Indiana. We appreciate you joining us on this Sunday. We're also hearing from Secretary of Energy Chris Wright, who says the Iranian regime is, quote, falling apart. We're going to discuss that next, coming up on Bloomberg This Weekend. Stick with us. We will be right back.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on some of today's top stories. Well, former President Barack Obama met with New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani for the first time yesterday, and they did it in front of a class of preschoolers.
The wheels on the bus go round and round, round and round, round and round.
I love that song. The two leaders, they discussed the mayor's vision for New York City and the importance of early childhood education. Now, it comes as Mayor Mamdani recently marked his 100th day in office. Over to tech news. Victory for a humanoid robot in Beijing after it beat the human half marathon world record. The winner in the race for robots was from a Chinese smartphone maker. It completed the 13-mile race in 15 minutes and 26 seconds. My goodness, it's a big difference from the 2-hour and 40-minute finish time of last year's winner. And the booster from Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket has returned. It landed on a vessel in the ocean. Now, the rocket blasted off from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida this morning. It was a reused booster for the first time to launch that massive 300-foot tall rocket. It's one of the largest in the world. It also carried a communication satellite for the company AST Space Mobile. Christina and Jake.
Have you been to a launch? Have you been to a?
No, I've never been.
I'd like to.
Have you?
No. I was talking with Ed about that offset. And he said
we
that you saw the Artemis 2 launch. It was like a spectacular. I'd love to do it.
He has an in. You can get in.
I know.
Lisa, stop showing us those
more.
creepy running robots. They
Yes,
make
they
me
are very
uneasy
creepy.
every
I
time.
agree.
Every
Yes.
time.
Unsettling.
All right, on much more serious news. President Trump says Special Envoy Steve Witkoff will head to Islamabad for talks on Tuesday that could last until Wednesday after Iran reversed its decision to reopen shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Energy Secretary Chris Wright was on CNN State of the Union earlier and had this to say about negotiations.
Negotiations are going very well. A lot of the chatter and noise you hear in public is really the signs of a regime that's falling apart. Different factions go in different directions. They're worried about trying to get some leverage at the end of these negotiations. I think President Trump and Vice President Vance have us on a pathway to a good ending of this conflict before long.
Joining us now is Axios' White House reporter Marc Caputo and Atlantic staff writer Nancy Youssef. Marc, let me start with you and just get your read of the latest here. The president making the rounds over the course of the morning, indicating that Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner are going to be the point people go into these talks. Curious what you make of that, the latest there, and sort of what you think will be notably different at this meeting compared to the one that took place between J.D. Vance and his Iranian counterparts last week.
Well, I have no idea what's going to be notably different. One of the things that seems to be a through line is everything seems to be notably the same. The only through line we have so far is that there's generally a ceasefire between the United States and Iran, between Israel and Lebanon. But otherwise, everyone keeps claiming that progress is being made, but what's really happening as a result? We've had a few things in Axios that we had reported. One, that there is an idea out there that the U.S. had started to advance of providing Iran access to its frozen assets, its currency, bank accounts essentially, of about $20 billion in return for them giving up uranium to the United States. It's highly rich uranium stockpiles. The Iranians wanted more money, and then the president came out and said he wasn't going to do this. However, there remain the very big issues. which is Iran has highly enriched uranium. The United States has access to Iran's money and has basically frozen them out from it. That's a possible trade item. Iran has closed the Strait of Hormuz. The United States wants it open and has a blockade. Those things seem tradable. And then more broadly, the United States has lots of weaponry and sanctions against Iran. Iran funds terrorist proxy groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. And so that also seems to be a trade item. But so far, we have not seen anything in writing that clearly shows what's up for trade, what's up for discussion, what the progress is. So until then, you have statements from President Trump and what you just played there, Energy Secretary Chris Wright, saying all this progress is happening, and then you have the Iranians saying, no, it's not. We do know they're talking because obviously they're talking, and also they're not shooting.
I do need to ask you, as we were speaking, your Axios colleague, Brock Ravid, was now contradicting the president, who said earlier that Vice President J.D. Vance would not be attending these talks. Axios is now reporting that Vice President J.D. Vance will lead the U.S. delegation for another round of talks in Islamabad. I know you've been on with us,
Correct.
but I didn't know if you'd heard that as well and what your take is on that.
I didn't want to come out and say it because I wasn't sure if it had come out yet. It would be a shocking breach of protocol if J.D. Vance were not there. So when you just listed those two names and didn't list J.D. Vance, I was rather surprised. Yes, J.D. Vance is the lead negotiator he's supposed to be, and he's going to be taking that role here as well.
All right, Nancy, let's go to you. I want to talk to you about some of the mixed messaging we're getting, not just from the administration, but also on the Iranian side as well. We've had infighting between IRGC members and more political elites. We've had this very bellicose tweet this morning, or social media post from the president, threatening to once again take out Iran's bridges and power plants, but at the same time going back to talks and saying things are progressing and they think that the U.S. can get a deal. What is going on here?
So you make a very important point, because over the end of the weekend, or at least on Friday, we saw talks about a ceasefire from the foreign minister, for only the state news media to say that actually the Ayatollah was on board. And the reason that was significant, not just because that it impacts the talks, but it was the first real break we'd seen, or fissures within the regime. Something we've been looking for as a sign of potential fractures for the regime. And so that was noteworthy. But I think you get at a very important point, is we're also seeing some broken patterns in the United States, where the president, facing challenges in terms of reaching a strategic outcome that is beneficial to the United States, is turning back to tactical threats. We saw this earlier with the threat to kill a civilization, and now, as you note in this latest social media post, he's threatened to strike Iranian infrastructure. In addition to being a violation of the Geneva Conventions, doing so doesn't answer the ultimate question that the U.S. is trying to resolve, which is how to get the strategic outcome that they want. And so it feels to me that we're on a cycle in which we're trying to leverage the U.S. military superiority to reach an understanding of what we want to achieve through these war aims. And as your colleague noted, there are a lot of things that the United States and Iran are trying to achieve. The nuclear program, reopening the Strait, sanctions relief, what would happen with proxies, the Iranian proxies, and the war in Lebanon. The last time there were serious negotiations about this, it took nearly 2 years to reach an agreement on just one component of it. And so I know there's been a back and forth today about whether the vice president is attending and what that means. I'm also curious if there will be more technical experts in this next round of negotiations, because in the past, these negotiations were successful not when the top sort of headline making attendees were there, but when the experts were able to work out these details, such that when folks like the vice president or the president's top negotiator came to the table, it wasn't to iron out these very, very specific points, but to really sort of put the final signature on it. So I'm curious if we'll see a different tactic in terms of how the United States approaches these talks, not just through who's attending from the White House, but who's attending from government agencies that could really help get to a resolution.
Marc, we got about a minute left, but I do want to ask you about your reporting on what's happening with Cuba, because the president has maintained that that's still very much a live issue for him going forward here. I'm struck the last time I sat down with Cuba's ambassador to the UN, he was reluctant to tell me with whom the Cubans had been meeting. Wouldn't say if it was Secretary Rubio or others. We now know that there has been a meeting. Give us, in this minute that we have left, the latest that you know of the status of those conversations as the president's threats continue.
Friday before last, 8 days ago, a high-level State Department delegation went down to Havana, touched down in Havana. First time United States government plane had done that since 2016 when President Obama went. They had meetings with the Cuban officials, Cuban apparatchiks, as well as the grandson of Raul Castro, known as Raulito, also nicknamed El Cangrejo, the crab. And they basically delivered the United States' longstanding message that you need to have economic and democratic reforms, free political prisoners, and start discussing returning seized assets that were taken during the revolution to U.S. persons and corporate interests. In return, the United States didn't offer much. They offered to help set up Starlink to increase internet access. They also made very clear, the United States did to the Cubans, that if there's a huge problem and a humanitarian crisis or societal collapse in Cuba, the United States is not going to stand idly by. That's not a direct threat, but boy, it's an indirect one.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Marc Caputo, White House reporter for Axios, and Nancy Youssef with The Atlantic. And before we go to break, the White House is now also telling CNN that Vice President Vance will be traveling to Pakistan after previously saying Vance was not attending those
The confusion continues. Our motive here is to make things clear. It is difficult given all that's happening in the Middle East and with the White House. Up next, the Pointed Quiz with a special guest contestant that is coming up right here on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg.com, and of course, on the Bloomberg Business app. Good news. It's now this weekend's Pointed News Quiz, the news quiz for risk takers.
David is back this week. Have you been practicing or studying
so much as I can. You know, I read regularly and
Tim
watch
beat me
Bloomberg
while
Television.
you were gone.
Tim beat you.
My very first loss. Tim
Tell me more.
But I know it's reveling in this.
Yes.
However, we have a guest star today
We do.
playing along with us. And Ludlow is back.
I think this is probably like the most dread and nervous I've felt in my career in television.
Tim and Joe felt the same way, but it'll be fine. It'll be fine. Lisa, our quiz master, will make you look good.
Okay, let me explain it to you, Julie, because you're new to this, Ed. Okay, so basically we have 3 different categories, okay?
Okay.
So you have 10, 10, 10, 30 chips in front of you, okay?
Nice.
What you do with those chips, you figure out how confident you are with each category. If you know the first category, you're going to put 10 chips, you're going to put 20 chips, maybe
30.
Maybe 30, all in one. It depends.
I
Or you
usually
can
just go
split it even.
across, but if you're really confident on one, you can slide them over.
I'll ask you the question, you write it on your board, and I'll tell you guys to flip it, and we'll see who gets
right
it.
and wrong.
Okay?
If he's wrong, what happens? You take the chips.
And if you're wrong, I get your chips.
Okay.
Okay.
And a little piece of your soul. Just a little.
Fair trade.
That is a fair trade.
Okay, so let's get to the
All right, what are the
categories first. Categories. Okay, first category is investigations. Second category, business leader. And third category, cons.
Cons.
Yes.
Feel very confident.
Does cons mean like pro and cons or,
like a
con artists
Yes,
or
correct.
convictions?
Con
Okay,
artists, yes.
thank you. Not that I'm an expert in any of those domains.
But it's good to ask.
Yep.
It's like asking the spelling bee leader to
Yeah.
spell the word.
Correct.
Use it in a sentence.
All
Okay,
right.
are you ready for the
I got
first
a bad
question?
feeling about this.
How
Let's
are we
do it.
betting? How are we betting?
I put nothing on the first
You
category.
put nothing on the first one?
Yeah.
Christina
I'm
has
going
10.
to go 5.
No, you can't go 5.
Let's do it in 10.
Come on,
man.
man.
Oh, I say I can't literally half-heartedly
No,
do it.
no, you
Let's
gotta
go
commit.
10.
10, all right, okay.
Okay, so you're going 10 on the first? So
Yeah.
10,
Yeah.
10, 10, 10.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
All right, here we go. The question is, Begonia Gomez was charged with influence peddling and commercial bribery. Her husband is which country's premier?
Oh,
Her name is Begonia Gomez.
okay.
Her husband is which country's premier? Which
I don't
country?
know. I really... no.
Come on, David.
All right.
This is
Everybody's
TV, David.
ready.
There's a
Okay, all
limited
right,
amount of time.
sorry.
We have a radio
I
audience.
also love the music, which is the reason I like to have
He does.
Yeah.
Okay, flip it. What do you
I
got,
wrote
David? We'll start with
Colombia.
David. You got
Colombia.
Colombia?
No.
Christina?
Spain?
Ed?
Spain.
is the answer.
That's why I
yes,
bet none. I bet
correct.
none, for the record.
She is
David,
the
I
wife
read
of
the news and
Pedro
watch Bloomberg
Sanchez.
Television, Gura.
Only...
So you didn't bet anything, David.
No,
okay, so
no,
you're
it's
so
fine.
good.
We're
You're
winning
smart.
it. We're doing well.
Fine.
We're doing well.
It's
We're doing
teaming
well.
up, we're winning.
We're against
Golly.
David. Here we go. Next one,
Feels that
category. Business leaders. Are you ready?
leaders.
Okay.
Oh, hold on, sorry. Yes.
Are you going with 10 for business
doing 10
leaders?
again.
Yes,
I'm
10
gonna go
again.
for
Okay,
10
good.
for
You're going
business
with
leaders.
20.
20.
20 for business
All right.
leaders. Okay.
Big
All right,
money,
here we go.
big money.
A man allegedly threw a Molotov cocktail at the San Francisco home of which business figure? What was the name
hope
of
it's the
this
right one.
business
It's one of
figure?
It's the other
One
one
of
I'm
the
going
It's
to
a
business
be.
figures.
Story.
It's the other one. It's, you know, it's the two. If it's one of them, it's the other one I'm going to be mad.
Ooh, All right, we're all ready? Flip it.
Sam Altman.
Sam Altman. All right. Everybody got it. Okay, good.
All right.
Excellent.
For the record, I've got 20 points for that.
I do wonder if but they still have their
20 as well.
22.
Right? Yeah.
So we're all tied up here.
All right, this is a
I
big
should have had
round.
more conviction that I was going to do a good job.
You should have known that one.
Next time, Ed.
Well, you're not there yet, Ed. You can still
All right,
take
are
it.
you ready for the cons? Okay, this
Yeah.
is like
I don't know what this is
con
gonna
art.
be.
Okay,
The
here we
French
go.
city.
Oh no.
David.
Okay.
The most David
founder
Gura comment ever.
The founder of which annual New York event was arrested on charges that he stole money raised for charity? What is the name of that New York event?
I know this because I hate this thing.
Yes,
I also
so do
take
I.
some issue with the question, which we can get into.
Oh,
but-
let's
I think the category was misleading.
No, we'll get to it.
Okay.
He's gonna. He's
right.
not
Hopefully
very
I'm
happy.
right.
Okay.
Yeah?
Okay, flip it. What do we got?
The Met Gala.
Met Gala, David.
SantaCon.
SantaCon.
Oh, I read
yes,
this
you
thing.
did
It was
read
everywhere.
that
This is a
story.
charity event?
The issue that I have is like
Charity
we have
event.
SantaCon in San Francisco as well.
We have
Charity
you
is what?
do.
The
No,
collection
it's
of
not
beers
like
in
a
these brown
universally
bags?
New York City thing.
Didn't it start
Yeah,
in New
it's in
York?
DC. I don't know, but
It had to have
Am
started
I
in New
right
York.
about that? Am I wrong?
Did you bet? Oh, I get your
10.
chips.
Whoa.
David, you're down.
This is probably my most loathed day of the year in the city. Not,
All
to be,
right.
not to be a Grinch,
David,
but it is a terrible...
we got to go for a bonus then. You know that.
Oh, I do appreciate it.
SantaCon
See?
is your most loathed day, or this current news quiz is your
Oh my
most loathed
gosh.
day?
We'll find out at the end of the segment.
Okay.
All right, we've got a bonus.
All right, we have a bonus. Okay, so
And
we
only
have
a minute left.
30. Only a minute left. Okay.
this
Ed
is
has
tight.
30, Christina has 30, and you have 20, David.
Yeah.
All right, antitrust. This is the category for
I'm
the
just gonna
bonus.
go all in.
All in.
Yeah.
You all in?
Good,
Okay,
done.
okay. All right, here we go. Which confectioner, a large consumer of hazelnuts, was a target of European Union antitrust raids this week? Which confectioner? What is the name
I can only
of
think of
that
the product.
company?
I can't think of the company.
It's a large consumer of hazelnuts.
Is there a distinction?
No. Does it? It's so delicious on a piece of bread, though.
I hope spelling is not counting here.
Come on, the name of the company.
Oh, I wrote Nutella, which
No,
isn't
the
the
name
name.
of the company.
Sorry.
Come on.
That's exactly what I was saying. I was
No, we're
like,
short on time.
I was gonna write Nutella,
Sorry,
and I couldn't remember.
I just didn't know how to spell
Ferrero
it.
That's, I did not spell it correctly either.
Sorry,
Well,
camera number. There you
Ferrero.
go. Yeah.
Ferrero.
Ferrero.
Look at you getting
Like
your cameras
Mateo.
right.
Oh, like kind of.
Mateo.
I did not know
But those are
until I
good,
was
the little
reading about this thing that
hazelnut,
Ferrero
the
Rocher made Nutella. I didn't know that.
But let's
I
be
did not know
honest,
that either.
Nutella inside of Artemis 2 in the spacecraft was a bigger
Yes,
story
it
than
was.
this with respect
Thank you.
antitrust
It
story.
floated right
I
past.
enjoy the debate about the game, perhaps more than the game itself. Don't
Well,
tell
I
our colleagues in the game department.
Really sandbagged you guys here. This was
You
great.
did. You did
Thank
fantastic.
Great,
You did
Ed.
really good.
You're gonna have to come back
David, you did okay.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that patronizing statement. All right. You can test your knowledge on all 10 questions. Take the Pointed News quiz at Bloomberg.com/pointed. Thanks
which
for
one of us
joining
you
us.
can beat.
Yeah, probably me. Thank you very much for joining us on Bloomberg this weekend. Join our colleagues in Asia this evening when global markets kick off trading at 7 p.m. Wall Street time. And tune in tomorrow during ETF IQ for David Rubenstein's conversation with Wells Fargo Chairman and CEO Charlie Sharp.